Declaro abierta la 53ª reunión del 49º periodo de sesiones del Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Me gustaría informarles que debido a los retrasos acumulados, la reunión de esta tarde continuará hasta las 19 horas, 7 de la tarde. Vamos a continuar el diálogo interactivo sobre el informe de misión de determinación de los hechos sobre Libia. Tiene la palabra la delegación de Senegal.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Sénégal s'aligne sur la déclaration prononcée par la Côte d'Ivoire au nom du groupe africain. Ma délégation remercie la haute commissaire pour son compte-rendu oral et salue la création d'une mission d'enquête, d'établissement des faits chargée d'enquêter sur les violations du droit international relatif aux droits humains, au droit international humanitaire et sur les atteintes à ces normes commises par toutes les parties au conflit en Libye, afin de lutter contre l'impunité généralisée et se félicite de la prorogation du mandat de la mission d'enquête en Libye pour une période de 9 mois afin de lui permettre de parachever son travail. Ma délégation voudrait exprimer sa vive préoccupation par rapport à la situation des migrants en Libye et l'impasse dans le processus politique. La situation des migrants et des réfugiés qui sont victimes de traitements ou punitions inhumains ou dégradants mérite d'être suivi de très près. À cet égard, ma délégation voudrait inviter toutes les parties au conflit à coopérer pleinement avec l'équipe d'enquêteurs de la mission d'établissement des faits et de l'aider dans son travail afin que toutes les responsabilités soient situées. Tout en saluant les efforts déployés par le comité de haut niveau de l'Union africaine sur la Libye, le Sénégal voudrait rappeler la nécessité de fournir un soutien technique et un renforcement des capacités à la Libye pour accompagner les institutions libyennes, en particulier le pouvoir judiciaire. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la France.
Président, la France remercie la mission d'établissement des faits pour son rapport. La France reste préoccupée par la multiplication des menaces de recours à la force, des appels à la violence, des actes d'intimidation et des entraves à la liberté de circulation en Libye. La priorité est de préserver la stabilité, l'unité du pays et le respect de la lettre et de l'esprit de l'accord de cessez-le-feu. La France encourage l'ensemble des acteurs libyens à travailler à la définition d'une feuille de route crédible pour la tenue des élections. Elle soutient les efforts des Nations Unies en ce sens. La tenue d'élections présidentielles et parlementaires libres, transparentes et inclusives sont nécessaires à la stabilisation pérenne du pays. Ces élections, par le cadre politique qu'elles contribueront à mettre en place, permettront également de mieux lutter contre les violations graves des droits de l'homme et du droit international humanitaire qui continuent d'être commises en Libye par toutes les parties, y compris par des forces et mercenaires étrangers, dans une impunité presque totale, notamment à l'encontre des réfugiés, des migrants et déplacés internes, mais également à l'encontre des membres de la société civile libyenne qui sont la cible d'arrestations et d'intimidations pour leurs opinions politiques, religieuses ou leur orientation sexuelle. La lutte contre l'impunité incombe d'abord aux autorités libyennes, qui doivent mettre en place des institutions judiciaires indépendantes et fortes. Les parties libyennes doivent également coopérer pleinement avec la Cour pénale internationale, conformément à la résolution 1970 de 2011. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Tiene la palabra UNICEF.
Mr. President, UNICEF follows with utmost concern the situation of child rights in Libya. Since the ceasefire, we have witnessed a reduction by 62% in the number of grave child rights violations documented last year. We welcome this progress, though the impact of violence continues. As ever, children are the first and most to suffer. Only last week, 2 children were killed and another child was injured due to unexploded ordnance and explosives remnants of wars. Last year, the UN in Libya verified that at least 26 children were killed or maimed due to ERWs. UNICEF calls on all parties to clear Libya of landmines and unexploded ordnances and to support children and families affected. Of equal concern is the violation of the rights of non-Libyan. According to our latest figures, there are 322 non-Libyan children under arbitrary and prolonged detention. The conditions under which these children are held are simply appalling. Of particular concern are raids against migrants, including last October in the Gargaresh area of Tripoli. This resulted in an increase in the number of detained women and children. UNICEF reiterates its appeal to the Libyan authorities to end the detention of migrant and refugee children and to ensure appropriate care options for them. We call once again for international efforts to expand safe and legal pathways for migration. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Venezuela. Venezuela, tiene la palabra.
Disculpe. Gracias, presidente. Reiteramos que los derechos humanos no pueden ser abordados mediante imposiciones selectivas de mandatos específicos contra estados soberanos, y menos aún cuando no cuentan con el consentimiento del país concernido. Reafirmamos que solo mediante el diálogo genuino y la cooperación, pilares fundamentales de las labores de este Consejo, es posible avanzar en la protección de los derechos humanos en cualquier parte del mundo. Conocemos las importantes dificultades y desafíos que vive Libia por la situación humana derivada del conflicto generado por los países hegemónicos. Deseamos ver nuevamente a Libia transitando hacia la unión de su pueblo, por lo cual debe acompañarse los esfuerzos por una solución política que conduzca a la reconciliación nacional. Alentamos al país a seguir manteniendo sus esfuerzos de cooperación con este Consejo y sus mecanismos. Apreciamos los esfuerzos de Libia para reforzar las labores de sus instituciones dedicadas a la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos mediante la promulgación de leyes y decretos para tal fin. Valoramos igualmente los programas sociales adoptados por Libia para mejorar el derecho a la salud, el agua y la educación de su pueblo, con énfasis en los grupos más vulnerables como las mujeres, los niños y las personas con discapacidad. Debe brindarse toda la cooperación y asistencia técnica que demande Libia en favor de la protección de los derechos humanos de su pueblo. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Je donne la parole à Luxembourg.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Luxembourg soutient pleinement la déclaration de l'Union européenne. Nous remercions la mission d'enquête sur la Libye pour son rapport de suivi et encourageons les autorités libyennes de poursuivre la coopération avec la mission. Au vu du climat d'instabilité politique et d'insécurité décrit dans le rapport et au vu du report des élections présidentielles, le Luxembourg soutient pleinement la prolongation du mandat de la mission d'enquête. Le Luxembourg condamne fermement toute violation des droits civils et politiques, dont les droits de libre association, de réunion et d'expression constatés par ce rapport. Le droit des Libyens à l'autodétermination et tout particulièrement leur participation sans entrave aux élections et à la vie publique sont des libertés fondamentales qui doivent être respectées. L'espace civique et particulièrement le droit des femmes défenseurs des droits humains doivent être protégés. Les attaques et actes d'intimidation contre le système judiciaire soulevés par ce rapport sont très inquiétants et sont une menace pour les élections à venir. Le Luxembourg tient à rappeler l'importance fondamentale de la tenue d'élections libres et inclusives. Le rapport de la mission d'enquête dénonce également les détentions arbitraires, disparitions forcées, exécutions extrajudiciaires et violences systématiques perpétrées dans le système pénitentiaire, particulièrement à l'encontre des migrants. Le Luxembourg condamne fermement ces actes et plaide pour le plein respect du droit international des droits humains et du droit international humanitaire en toutes circonstances. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Tiene la palabra China.
主席先生，利比亚局势动荡持续多年，不仅给利比亚人民造成深重灾难，也严重冲击地区及全球安全与稳定。中方始终认为，利比亚问题只能通过政治途径解决，军事手段没有出路。国际社会应加强协作，推动利人主导、利人所有的政治进程，发挥联合国促和主渠道作用。应坚持政治谈判与反恐并重，防止恐怖极端势力在利比亚做大。人权理事会关于利比亚人权状况的讨论，应有助于保护利比亚人民的人权，有助于政治解决进程。中方愿同国际社会一道，为早日实现利比亚和平稳定、重启政治进程做出积极努力。谢谢主席先生。
Tiene la palabra España.
España se adhiere a la intervención de la Unión Europea y agradece a la misión de verificación de los hechos la presentación de su informe. Permítanme reiterar el firme apoyo de mi país a la misión para Libia y a su valiosa contribución para asegurar una transición democrática en el país basada en el respeto a los derechos humanos y en la reparación para las víctimas. Hacemos un llamamiento a las autoridades libias para que sigan colaborando con la misión para facilitar sus investigaciones. Para España, seguir trabajando en la consecución de una transición política que encamina a Libia hacia un futuro pacífico y estable sigue siendo esencial. Para ello, recalcamos la importancia de la pronta celebración de elecciones generales justas y libres. España sigue muy preocupada por la situación de los derechos humanos en Libia, que sigue deteriorándose, tal y como recoge la misión en su informe. Nos preocupa la constatación de que las mujeres que ya se encuentran desproporcionadamente afectadas por el conflicto están viendo dificultada su participación en la vida pública. Creemos firmemente que la plena participación de las mujeres libias en el proceso de reconciliación nacional es una condición indispensable para conseguir una paz duradera e instamos a las autoridades libias a aumentar los esfuerzos en este sentido. En su informe subrayan la importancia de que la comunidad internacional dé apoyo a su mandato centrado en las violaciones y abusos desde el año 2016 que pueden afectar un futuro en Libia basado en la justicia y la reconciliación nacional. ¿Qué puede hacer la comunidad internacional para contribuir a la plena realización del mandato encomendado a la misión? Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Arabia Saudita.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. أود في البداية أن أرحب بمعالي رئيس وأعضاء البعثة المستقلة لتقصي الحقائق في ليبيا ونشكرهم على جهودهم. كما أنتهز هذه الفرصة ليشيد بتعاون والتزام ليبيا مع آليات حقوق الإنسان. كما نعيد التأكيد على التضامن مع الشقيقة ليبيا وحرص بلادي على وحدة وسلامة الأراضي الليبية ودعمها لكافة الجهود الرامية للتوصل لحل سياسي للأزمة الليبية. ونؤمن بأن الحل في ليبيا يجب أن يكون ليبيا. السيد الرئيس، نرحب بجهود كل من جامعة الدول العربية والاتحاد الإفريقي والأمم المتحدة لتحقيق الاستقرار المنشود في ليبيا والحفاظ على أمن وسلامة دول الجوار. كما ترحب بلادي بتوقيع اللجان العسكرية المشتركة الليبية لاتفاق دائم لوقف إطلاق النار برعاية الأمم المتحدة. ونأمل أن تؤدي تلك الجهود إلى وحدة وسيادة ليبيا بما يفضي إلى خروج كافة المقاتلين الأجانب ويؤسس لحل دائم يمنع التدخل الخارجي الذي يعرض الأمن العربي للمخاطر. السيد الرئيس، ختاما نأمل بأن تتحقق آمال وتطلعات شعب ليبيا في حياة كريمة وآمنة، وندعم استمرار تقديم المساعدة التقنية وبناء القدرات لحماية وتعزيز حقوق الإنسان في ليبيا، مؤكدين على أهمية السلام والأمن كشرط أساسي للحفاظ على حقوق الإنسان والحريات الأساسية. وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
Shukran. Tiene la palabra Holanda. Países Bajos.
Mr. President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU intervention. We praise the members of the fact-finding mission for their update and invaluable work. We also praise Libya's commitment and assistance to the work of the mission so far and reiterate the importance of continued this assistance. The work of the mission is crucial, especially to show the many victims and their families that their call for justice is not forgotten. Its work contributes to respect for human rights, rule of law and sustainable peace and security, and allows Libya to deal with the past and draw lessons for the future. As co-chair of the Working Group on International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights of the Berlin Process, we stand ready to continue to support the FFM in their work and support Libya in implementing the recommendations. Despite challenges faced by the FFM, it has been able to gather a significant amount of information. However, its work is not completed. An extension of its mandate and the Human Rights Council in June is essential to fulfill its goals and to further increase its effectiveness and sustainability, especially in light of the worrying developments on the ground. We strongly urge for the renewal of the mandate as well as the provision of adequate resources and hope others will do so as well. Commissioners, the report provides steps to be taken. How can the international community best support these steps towards accountability and national reconciliation? Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Suiza.
Monsieur le Président, la Suisse remercie la mission pour son important travail. La Suisse déplore les nombreuses violations du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme qui continuent d'être perpétrés en Libye. Mon pays appelle tous les acteurs en Libye à mettre immédiatement fin aux violations du droit international. Il appelle les autorités libyennes à en juger les responsables. La reddition des comptes et la lutte contre l'impunité constituent les prérequis essentiels pour mener à un processus de justice transitionnelle
et à la réconciliation nationale. La Suisse est en outre très préoccupée par l'augmentation de la répression contre la société civile. Elle s'inquiète en particulier des récentes arrestations arbitraires par des membres de l'Agence de sécurité intérieure. Elle appelle les autorités libyennes à libérer immédiatement les personnes détenues arbitrairement, à respecter les droits civils et politiques, ainsi qu'à préserver l'intégrité du système judiciaire de toute ingérence extérieure. Finalement, la Suisse salue la coopération des autorités libyennes avec la mission et appelle à garantir l'accès de celle-ci à toutes les personnes qui souhaitent l'approcher. Mon pays considère que le mandat de la mission devra être prolongé lors de la prochaine session afin que son travail puisse être mené à bien. Madame, Messieurs les experts, quelles mesures avez-vous identifiées pour améliorer l'espace de la société civile dans le contexte actuel? Je vous remercie.
Merci. Tiene la palabra la Federación Rusa.
Господин председатель, обстановка в стране и вокруг нее остается в целом стабильной. Для достижения поставленных задач в области защиты прав человека необходимо четко следовать выработанной дорожной карте по ливийскому урегулированию. Вместе с тем, динамика развития событий в Ливии после отмены планировавшихся на декабрь 2021 года всеобщих выборов вызывает беспокойство. Рассчитываем, что их перенос не спровоцирует новую вспышку насилия в этой стране, что может потенциально усугубить реализацию прав человека. Не видим альтернативы комплексному мирному решению ливийского кризиса под эгидой ООН. Россия намерена и далее активно участвовать в международных усилиях по продвижению политического урегулирования в Ливии как путем целенаправленной работы с самими ливийскими сторонами, так и в многосторонних форматах. Благодарю за внимание.
Спасибо. Tiene la palabra Kuwait.
سيد الرئيس، اطلع وفد بلادي على تقرير البعثة المستقلة لتقصي الحقائق في ليبيا، وأخذ علما بما جاء فيه، وإنه في هذا الصدد يشيد ويثني على تعاون السلطات الليبية مع البعثة الدولية وبتمكينها القيام بكافة مهامها وأعمالها، وهو الأمر الذي يجب تسجيله وتقديره. ونأمل على أن يتم دعم الجهود المقدمة من المؤسسات الوطنية الليبية لوقف جميع انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان. سيد الرئيس، إن بلادي تثمن عاليا جهود السلطات الليبية في حماية وتعزيز حقوق الإنسان، وتناشد المجتمع الدولي تقديم المساعدة لها وتمكينها بإنجاح مسار العدالة الانتقالية والمصالحة الوطنية، كونها الطريق الرئيسي لتحقيق الاستقرار والازدهار الذي يتطلع له الشعب الليبي الشقيق، والضامن لنجاح المسارات السياسية والاقتصادية والأمنية المنبثقة عن عملية الحوار الوطني ومسار برلين. ختاما، تدعم بلادي كافة الجهود الرامية لدعم ليبيا وشعبها الشقيق العزيز، ونشدد على أهمية استمرار التعاون ما بين الآليات الدولية وليبيا، وبما يسهم في تقديم مساعدة التقنية لها وبناء قدراتها في مجال حقوق الإنسان. وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
Shukran. Tiene la palabra Marruecos.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. تشكر المملكة المغربية فريق البعثة الدولية المستقلة لتقصي الحقائق في ليبيا على تقريرها المرحلي، وتثمن عمل الفريق الذي لم يدخر جهدا للنهوض بالمهمة المنوطة به رغم الظروف الصعبة المتعلقة بالتحديات الأمنية وتلك المرتبطة بإكراهات الأزمة الصحية أو النقص في الموارد البشرية. وتجدد المملكة المغربية تأكيد دعمها للجهود الأممية الرامية لدعم حالة الاستقرار في ليبيا، بما يوفر الظروف المواتية لوضع الأطر الملائمة لإجراء الانتخابات ضمن إطار سلمي وبرعاية أممية لوضع حد لصراع دام أزيد من 11 سنة. ومن هنا تأتي أهمية أن يكون الإطار التشريعي للانتخابات في ليبيا توافقيا وشموليا يوفر ضمانات نجاحها، مما يسهم في دعم سيادة ليبيا وإرساء مؤسسات دائمة قادرة على تهيئة البيئة الضامنة لحقوق الإنسان والنهوض بها، ويمكن المجتمع الدولي من التوفر على محاور ليبي وحيد. في هذا السياق تجدد المملكة المغربية عزمها مواصلة جهود تعزيز السلام في ليبيا، وأن تظل وفية لالتزامها بتوفير أحسن الظروف والمناخ الملائم للأشقاء الليبيين لتحفيزهم على إيجاد الحلول المناسبة لبناء دولتهم العصرية والنهوض بها، إيمانا منها بأن ما يحتاجه الليبيين اليوم هو المصاحبة دون وعظ أو تدخل في أفق إيجاد شروط سلام دائم، بما في ذلك عن طريق نزع السلاح ورحيل المرتزقة الأجانب وإعادة دمج الميليشيات المحلية وتعزيز مؤسسات دولة القانون والمساعدة على إعادة بناء البلاد بفضل مواردها الخاصة ومن خلال استثمارات يديرها الليبيين أنفسهم. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Shukran. Tiene la palabra Argelia.
السيد الرئيس، يأخذ وفد بلادي علما بتقرير الصادر عن بعثة تقصي الحقائق في ليبيا، ويشدد على أن تدعم هذه البعثة جهود الدولة الليبية بمؤسساتها الوطنية لوقف جميع انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان وتعزيزها. تؤكد الجزائر على أهمية تحقيق المصالحة الوطنية في ليبيا بمساهمة جميع أبنائها في إطار مشروع وطني شامل وجامع يحقق طموحاتهم المشروعة في بناء دولة ديمقراطية. تشدد الجزائر على ضرورة إيلاء الاهتمام اللازم إلى المسارين السياسي والأمني إلى جانب الاستحقاق الانتخابي المنتظر، حيث يفترض أن تعمل جميع المسارات سالفة الذكر بطريقة منسجمة وتكاملية لإنهاء الأزمة. وتؤكد الجزائر على أهمية الحفاظ على وقف إطلاق النار والعمل على تثبيته عبر تفعيل جميع أركانه، بما في ذلك نشر المراقبين وانسحاب القوات والمقاتلين الأجانب، وكذلك احترام حظر توريد الأسلحة إلى ليبيا. وبالنظر إلى ما تخلفه الأزمة الليبية من تداعيات مباشرة على دول الجوار، فإن هذه الأخيرة تطلع إلى المساهمة في تجسيد أهداف المسار الأمني بالتعاون مع لجنة 5+5، حيث تم التعبير عن هذا الموضوع بطريقة جلية وقوية خلال اجتماع الجزائر في يوليو الماضي. وفي الأخير تحث الجزائر المفوضية والمجلس على تقديم المساعدات التقنية والدعم الفني وبناء القدرات للسلطات الليبية ومؤسساتها الوطنية. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
شكرا. Tiene la palabra Yemen.
السيد الرئيس، استمعنا إلى تقرير لجنة تقصي الحقائق حول أوضاع حقوق الإنسان في دولة ليبيا الشقيقة، وأخذنا علما بالصعوبات التي تواجه السلطات الليبية لمعالجة قضايا حقوق الإنسان في ظل الظروف المعقدة التي تعيشها ليبيا حاليا. ونحن نرى أن هذه الأوضاع تستدعي مزيدا من الدعم والمساعدة حتى تتمكن ليبيا من الإيفاء بالتزاماتها في مجال حقوق الإنسان، وبشكل خاص تعزيز القدرات الوطنية للسلطات الليبية لإحلال السلام والاستقرار في ليبيا. كما نؤيد كل الجهود والمبادرات الإقليمية والدولية الهادفة إلى إيجاد حل سياسي في ليبيا يضمن أمنها واستقلالها ووحدة أراضيها. إننا ندعو مكتب المفوض السامي لتقديم المزيد من الدعم وبناء القدرات ومساعدة ليبيا في الاستحقاقات المتعلقة بمواجهة تحديات المرحلة القادمة. وتؤكد اليمن على دعمها ومساندتها لليبيا الشقيقة من أجل الانتقال بالبلاد نحو الاستقرار والتنمية الاقتصادية من خلال تبني استراتيجية وطنية للخروج من الأوضاع الصعبة التي يعيشها الشعب الليبي الشقيق. وشكرا.
شكرا. Tiene la palabra Sudán.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يضم السودان صوته إلى البيانات المقدمة بالنيابة عن مجموعات الانتماء، ويؤكد في البدء على وحدة وسلامة الأراضي الليبية، ويشدد على سيادة واستقلالية دولة ليبيا الشقيقة، كما يؤكد تضامنه مع الشعب الليبي الشقيق وحقه في التمتع بجميع حقوقه الأساسية، ويثمن تعاون السلطات الليبية مع بعثة تقصي الحقائق وكذلك مع مختلف آليات حقوق الإنسان، ويؤكد دعمه لكافة الجهود الرامية لإنجاح الحوار الوطني الليبي بمشاركة جميع الأطراف بعيدا عن أي تدخلات وأجندات خارجية، بما يضمن تحقيق طموحات الشعب الليبي وآماله في الحياة الكريمة المستقرة الآمنة. يثمن السودان كذلك جهود دولة ليبيا الشقيقة لتعزيز واحترام حقوق الإنسان ويدعو مجلس حقوق الإنسان وكافة المجتمع الدولي للاستمرار في تقديم الدعم اللازم لإنجاح مسار المصالحة الوطنية والتحول الديمقراطي تلبية لرغبات وتطلعات الشعب الليبي الشقيق، خاصة فيما يتعلق بتقديم الدعم الفني وبناء قدرات الأجهزة الوطنية الليبية المختلفة ومؤسساتها الوطنية وفقا لاحتياجاتها. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Túnez.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. يرحب وفد بلادي بأعضاء البعثة الدولية المستقلة لتقصي الحقائق في ليبيا ويشكرهم على الإحاطة المقدم للمجلس خلال هذا النقاش، ويشير بالتزام الحكومة الليبية بالتعاون مع هذه البعثة ومع مجلس حقوق الإنسان وآلياته ومكتب المفوضية السامية وما أبدته من إرادة لتعزيز حقوق الإنسان وحمايتها في ليبيا، ويؤكد على أهمية مواصلة وتعزيز تقديم المساعدة الفنية وبناء القدرات اللازمة لليبيا ومؤسساتها الوطنية. كما نجدد استعداد تونس لمواصلة تقديم الدعم الفني واللوجستي لفريق البعثة وتوفير ظروف الإقامة الملائمة لهم ببلادنا للاطلاع بدورهم على أحسن وجه. وستواصل تونس دورها في تقديم العون والمساندة لدعم الحوار والمصالحة الوطنية والتوافق بين الأشقاء الليبيين لإيجاد حل ليبي بما من شأنه أن يعيد لليبيا أمنها واستقرارها ويساعدها على استرجاع مكانتها كطرف إقليمي وازن بعيدا عن أي تدخل في شأنها الداخلي. ونحن على ثقة تامة في قدرة الأشقاء الليبيين على التوصل لتوافقات ضرورية لضمان أفضل الظروف لإنجاح الاستحقاقات السياسية القادمة بدعم من دول الجوار والاتحاد الإفريقي والأمم المتحدة والمجتمع الدولي. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Shukran. And now I give the floor to the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the fact-finding mission for its reporting on the human rights situation in Libya, despite the numerous challenges faced by the FFM in pursuing its work. We share the FFM's concerns regarding human rights violations and abuses and violations of international humanitarian law in Libya. We underscore the need for the international community to continue strong support for the FFM to help end the cycle of violence, promote accountability for perpetrators of human rights abuses, protect civic space, and promote respect for the rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association. The prolonged political transition resulting from delayed elections underlines the continued need for the FFM to monitor this crucial period. Today's dialogue highlights the need to continue this mandate with the support of the Libyan authorities in order to tackle impunity and give victims an opportunity to have their voices heard and their rights upheld. How can we support efforts to promote accountability and foster long-term peace and security in Libya? I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Bélgica.
Monsieur le Président, la Belgique s'associe à la déclaration de l'Union européenne. Nous remercions les membres de la mission indépendante d'établissement des faits pour l'important travail qu'ils livrent depuis la mise en place de la mission par ce Conseil en juin 2020. La situation des droits humains en Libye demeure très inquiétante. Mon pays est particulièrement préoccupé par les violences liées aux élections et les attaques motivées par l'affiliation politique ou visant en particulier les femmes s'engageant dans des activités publiques. Nous soulignons l'importance du respect et de la protection de la pleine indépendance du pouvoir judiciaire, amené à remplir un rôle clé dans le cadre de litiges électoraux. Les Libyens doivent être en mesure de choisir leurs dirigeants à l'issue d'élections crédibles, transparentes et inclusives. Il est inacceptable que les défenseurs des droits humains continuent à être arrêtés et détenus arbitrairement. De même, la détention de migrants et de réfugiés dans des centres où des violations des droits humains ont été rapportées, y compris la torture, la privation de nourriture et l'extorsion, ne peut être tolérée. Il résulte clairement de la situation sur le terrain et des rapports soumis par la mission d'établissement des faits que la tâche qui attend ses membres demeure considérable. Le renouvellement de leur mandat en juin sera de ce fait crucial. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Bahrein.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. بداية يضم وفد بلادي صوته لبيانات المجموعات السياسية والإقليمية التي ينتمي إليها، ويتقدم بالشكر إلى بعثة تقصي الحقائق في ليبيا على جهودها في إعداد التقرير محل النقاش. وفي هذا السياق يود وفد بلادي الإشادة بما أبدته السلطات الليبية من تعاون مع لجنة تقصي الحقائق بهدف مساعدتها في الاطلاع بولايتها، لا سيما من حيث تمكينها من إجراء تحقيقات نزيهة بشأن الانتهاكات المتعلقة بالقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان والقانون الدولي الإنساني، وذلك إيمانا من السلطات الليبية بأهمية بذل كافة المساعي لوقف انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان ومحاربة الإفلات من العقاب باعتباره السبيل الوحيد لتعزيز حالة حقوق الإنسان في عموم الجغرافيا الليبية. السيد الرئيس، يشدد وفد بلادي على أهمية استجابة الأمم المتحدة من خلال المفوضية السامية لحقوق الإنسان ولجنة تقصي الحقائق للأمم المتحدة في ليبيا لاحتياجات الدولة الليبية في مجال التعاون التقني وبناء القدرات من أجل تمكينها من الاطلاع بمسؤولياتها المتعلقة بتعزيز احترام حقوق الإنسان ومحاربة الإفلات من العقاب. ختاما، يجدد وفد بلادي دعوته للمجتمع الدولي لتحمل مسؤولياته إزاء الوضع في ليبيا لرفع التحديات وتخفيف المعاناة وحفظ السيادة الوطنية الليبية. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Shukran, tiene la palabra el Reino Unido.
President, first of all, let me welcome the update from the fact-finding mission. Your work is critical to ending impunity for human rights violations and abuses in Libya. We are pleased to see the increased political stability in Libya over the last 2 years. It is vital that the same progress is made towards accountability, bringing perpetrators to justice, as well as preventing further violations and abuses from occurring. We are gravely concerned about enforced disappearances and reports of human trafficking and sexual exploitation. We are alarmed about restrictions on media freedom and civil society groups, and the mistreatment of people in vulnerable situations, including migrants. Looking forward, the UK strongly supports the renewal of the fact-finding mission's mandate in order to ensure the human rights situation continues to be monitored on the ground. The fact-finding mission's contribution to transitional and restorative justice is and will continue to be an inherent part of the peace process. Distinguished members, how can the international community help you to achieve your aims? What support do you need to be able to effectively conduct your important work? Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Grecia.
Gracias, Presidente. Greece allies with the EU statement and thanks the fact-fighting mission for its report. We commend Libya for its cooperation with the FFM. We remain concerned by the reports of numerous violations of international humanitarian law and serious violations and abuses of international human rights law, some of which may constitute crimes against humanity. We recall that all parties to the conflict, including foreign fighters and mercenaries, have committed such violations and abuses. We underscore the importance of ensuring accountability. We are worried by the shrinking of civil society space and reports of threats against human rights defenders, journalists and political actors, including women. Recent reports of arrests and physical attacks against them for their political or religious opinion or their sexual orientation are also of concern. The dissolution of the Tanvir movement illustrates this downturn. Greece, as a neighboring country, attaches particular importance to the prosperity and stability of Libya and fully supports a Libya-owned political solution aiming to ensure the country's sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence. In closing, let me stress the importance of the implementation of the ceasefire agreement as well as the relevant UN Security Council resolutions, and also the importance of the implementation of the roadmap set by the 5+5 Committee for the immediate and full withdrawal of all foreign military forces, combatants and mercenaries. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Turquía.
Mr. President, we thank the fact-finding mission for its update. We welcome the mission's first-ever visit to Benghazi. The report sheds light on human rights violations against the backdrop of a changing political landscape. Maintaining stability, political unity, and territorial integrity of Libya should be our common objective. We support Libyan-led and Libyan-owned political process. We also assist Libyans in their endeavors to ensure calm on the ground and contribute to the reconciliation efforts indispensable for accountability. The remedy to the current impasse lies with the holding of free, fair, and credible elections. Libyans' right to participate in public life and choose their own representatives should be respected. We support UN's and Libyans' efforts towards this objective. The work on the constitutional basis with the broadest consensus possible should start without delay. In the meantime, preserving calm and maintaining stability are critical. Utmost attention must be given to the protection of civilians, especially vulnerable groups, in this regard. Turkey will continue to support Libyans in their quest for lasting peace and stability. We call on the international community to stay united and act with one voice at this critical time Libya is facing. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Irlanda.
Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU and thanks the independent fact-finding mission for their update. Accountability for human rights violations is an important step in Libya's peace process, and the work of the mission is a vital element of these accountability efforts. It is essential that the mission is given the necessary time and resources to complete this work, and that all stakeholders are able to safely engage with the mission. We condemn the increased targeting of humanitarian workers and civil society actors, including arbitrary arrest, torture and harassment by authorities, as well as the continued suspension of visas for humanitarian staff. Ireland calls for an end to the practice of arbitrary detention, including of migrants and refugees. The horrific abuses endured by detainees, including sexual and gender-based violence, are unacceptable. We remain concerned by the disproportionate impact of the conflict on women and girls. In this context, we particularly regret that the Libyan authorities have suspended work on a national action plan on women, peace and security, which was agreed in collaboration with UN Women only last year. We underline the need for the maintenance of the ceasefire agreement by all parties amid the recent concerning rise of political tensions. What concrete support can the international community provide in order to further the prosecution of human rights violations in Libya, including violations committed against migrants and refugees? Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Malta.
Thank you. Malta aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and thanks the members of the fact-finding mission for their report. We remain deeply concerned about the human rights situation in Libya and the ongoing violence, particularly against human rights defenders and journalists. We emphasize the need to ensure accountability for all victims. We commend the important work of the fact-finding mission and strongly urge for the renewal of the mandate in June, and we also encourage all relevant actors to fully cooperate with the mission. Malta emphasizes that there can be no military solution in Libya, and we urge all sides to respect the de facto ceasefire in place since October 2020. The Berlin process remains the key framework in ensuring a successful transition alongside UN political, military and economic tracks. In reiterating our support for the efforts of the Special Advisor to the UN Secretary-General in Libya, Ms. Stephanie Williams, we reiterate the need for all Libyan institutions to work together with a view to holding free, fair and inclusive elections as soon as possible. In conclusion, Malta reiterates its readiness to assist Libya in its path towards a peaceful, stable future for the country and its people, and would like to ask what more member states can do to help the fact-finding mission complete its mandate. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Mauritania.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. يحيط وفدي علما بتقريري بعد تقصي الحقائق ويعرب عن تضامن بلاد الكامل مع الشعب الليبي الشقيق ويؤكد على وحدة ليبيا واستقلالها وسيادتها على كامل ترابها الوطني. كما يثني على الالتزام والتعاون البناء للسلطات الليبية مع آليات مجلس حقوق الإنسان وبعثية تقصي الحقائق والذي مكن البعثة من أداء عملها في ظروف مرضية. وفي الوقت الذي يهيب فيه بدعم هذه الآلية لجهود المؤسسات الوطنية الليبية يؤكد على اختصاص القضاء الوطني الليبي في ملاحقة مرتكبي انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان ومكافحة الإفلات من العقاب وتعزيز حقوق الإنسان بشكل عام. السيد الرئيس، إننا نحيي جهود السلطات الليبية وإرادتها المصممة في المجالات التشريعية والتنفيذية والقضائية الرامية إلى تعزيز واحترام حقوق الإنسان، ونشدد على أهمية تحمل المجتمع الدولي مسؤولياته إزاء الوضع في ليبيا ورفع التحديات وتخفيف المعاناة، وذلك عبر إنجاح مسار العدالة الانتقالية والمصالحة الوطنية ودعم الحوار الليبي. وفي هذا الإطار نحث المفوضة السامية والمجلس على تقديم المساعدة التقنية والدعم الفني وبناء قدرات السلطات الليبية ومؤسساتها الوطنية. وفي الختام أتمنى لليبيا الشقيقة وشعبها دوام الاستقرار والسلام والازدهار. أشكركم.
Shukran. Tiene la palabra Sudán del Sur.
Thank you, Mr. President. The delegation of South Sudan aligns itself with the African Group statement and have taken note of the report of the fact-finding mission in Libya. We appreciate the Libyan government for the cooperation with the Human Rights Council and with the FFM that enable them to conduct their work in the country. South Sudan understands the current situation in Libya and calls on the international community to support efforts being taken by the government to promote and respect human rights in order to restore peace, stability, and prosperity in Libya. We also call the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to continue providing technical assistance and capacity building to Libyan government to enhance the rule of law and guarantee protection and promotion of the human rights in the country. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Tanzania.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United Republic of Tanzania Thank you, Mr. President. The United Republic of Tanzania notes the report of the independent fact-finding mission on Libya. We wish to commend the government of Libya for extending its cooperation to the independent fact-finding mission to discharge its mandate to conduct fact-finding investigations in the country. Mr. President, the United Republic of Tanzania reiterates the recommendations made by the fact-finding mission for the United Nations to provide technical support and capacity building to Libya to strengthen institutions in the country, including judiciary and law enforcement agencies. Mr. President, in conclusion, we call on the international community to continue rendering necessary support, including financial assistance to Libya, so as to improve the livelihood of the people of Libya. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Sierra Leona.
Mr. President, Sierra Leone takes note of the report issued by the fact-finding mission in Libya. We commend the cooperation of the Libyan government with the mission, particularly through facilitating access to the western and eastern parts of the country. We welcome the sense of resilience and fortitude of the FFM in the execution of its mandates in the face of all odds since the adoption of Resolution 4339 of 22nd June 2020. Sierra Leone applauds the efforts of the Libyan authorities to operationalize the transitional justice process through the establishment of the National Reconciliation Commission, as well as the Libyan Stability Initiative. We call on the international community and relevant stakeholders, including the UN, to intensify support towards transition to the rule of law, democracy, and greater respect for human rights. In this context, we call on the UN to support a victim-centered reconciliation process through a transitional justice approach that ensures accountability, reconciliation, and reparation for victims. Mr. President, we encourage the transitional government to expedite the passing of a new constitution to ensure credible parliamentary and presidential elections that will take place in a timely manner and in a free and secure environment that guarantees women's full, meaningful participation, including minority groups. We strongly believe that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights should continue to provide technical support and capacity building to the national authorities, including law enforcement and justice agencies, in order to enhance their capabilities to assume their responsibilities prevents violations and enhances the rule of law and respects human rights. We also stress the importance of the fact-finding mission support for the national efforts to stop all human rights violations, fight impunity, and promote human rights in general. We join calls for the immediate withdrawal of all foreign troops, including mercenaries and bandits from Libya. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Y último orador de los estados, Camerún.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Cameroun s'aligne sur la déclaration prononcée par la Côte d'Ivoire au nom du groupe africain. Ma délégation prend bonne note du rapport et se félicite des informations communiquées par la Commission. Ma délégation reconnaît que le respect et la protection des droits de l'homme constituent le socle fondamental pour une bonne gouvernance étatique. Il constitue également une garantie solide pour la paix, la sécurité, le développement et l'épanouissement des citoyens. Le Cameroun se félicite de la pleine coopération entre les autorités libyennes et les mécanismes des Nations Unies. Ma délégation se félicite de l'option prise par les autorités libyennes de surmonter les difficultés à travers le dialogue et la concertation. Le Cameroun encourage la Libye de maintenir ses efforts de paix et ramener l'unité du pays. Enfin, le Cameroun exhorte tous les partenaires au premier desquels le Bureau du Haut Commissariat des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme d'accompagner la Libye vers la voie de la paix et de la concorde. Je vous remercie pour votre aimable attention.
Merci. Ahora vamos a pasar a la lista de organizaciones no gubernamentales. En primer lugar, A Man Against Discrimination.
رئيس وأعضاء بعثة تقصي الحقائق. لا تزال ليبيا مكان غير آمن لأحد بما في ذلك المدافعون عن حقوق الإنسان والصحفيين وممثلي السلطات القضائية والتشريعية والتنفيذية ومن قبلهم جميعا المدنيين سواء من الليبيين أو الأجانب. على المدار الفترة بين نوفمبر 2021 ومارس 2022 اعتقل جهاز الأمن الداخلي التابع للمجلس الرئاسي لحكومة الوحدة الوطنية 7 أشخاص على الأقل من بينهم نشطاء ومدافعون حقوقيون إلى جانب أفراد نشطوا مؤخرا على الإنترنت لمناقشة مشاكل حقوق الإنسان في ليبيا. ثم نشر جهاز الأمن الداخلي اعترافات مصورة تم الحصول عليه بالإكراه يعترفون فيها بالنشر قيم لا أخلاقية والتعاون مع منظمات دولية. الأفراد الواردة أسماءهم في مقاطع الفيديو يغادرون الآن في خوف شديد مما قد يحدث لهم. تتواصل القيود التعسفية التي تفرض مفوضية المجتمع المدني في طرابلس على العمل المنظمات والصحفيين والانتهاكات الممنهجة بحقهم. ومن أحدث الأمثلة على هذه الانتهاكات إصدار مفوضية المجتمع المدني طرابلس أعلان تعليق قيد جميع المنظمات الرافضة للائحة 286 عن العمل واعتبارهم منظمات غير قانونية. نحث الدول على تجديد ولاية بعثة تقصي الحقائق بشأن ليبيا وضمان حصولها على موارد الكافية لتنفيذ ولايتها، ونوصي دول الأعضاء بإدانة شديدة لمرتكبي انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان وأي محاولة للتعطيل العملية السياسية ومعاقبة الأفراد والجماعات المسؤولة عن ذلك. شكرا.
Thank you. Amnistía Internacional.
Mr. President, during Amnesty International's visit to Libya last month, we met scores of victims of arbitrary detention, torture, enforced disappearance, and sexual violence, as well as relatives of those extrajudicially executed or otherwise unlawfully killed. Former detainees recalled horrific conditions leading to death in custody. Such abuses are committed by militias and armed groups that receive funding from the state. At this very moment, the Internal Security Agency, led by militia leader Lotfi al-Hayari, is embarking on a campaign of arbitrarily arresting young men and forcing them to confess on camera, merely for peacefully expressing their views. Victims have no recourse to justice. I met families appealing to the public prosecutor to investigate crimes committed against their loved ones, to no avail. Victims asked not to meet in public, fearing reprisals. During our visit to Sirte, we were not allowed to speak to residents. Instead, security agents followed and harassed us. Space for Libyan human rights defenders and other civil society actors continue to shrink. Mr. President, Amnesty International welcomes the Libya delegation sponsoring of a resolution renewing the fact-finding mission during the 48th session. Given the magnitude of ongoing abuses committed with impunity, it's imperative that the Council set the foundation now to extend the mandate with the fact-finding mission by at least 2 years. We fear that in the absence of strong accountability efforts, the cycle of grave abuses will simply drag on. Thank you.
Thank you. Human Rights Watch.
Human Rights Watch welcomes the report of the fact-finding mission, finding serious human rights violations perpetrated by armed groups around the country and a prevailing culture of impunity. A team of our researchers recently returned from Libya and noted that conditions remain precarious and armed groups continue to benefit from near impunity as political rifts deepen. Despite improvement in the day-to-day life of Tripoli residents after the end of the conflict in its southern suburbs in 2020, tens of thousands remain internally displaced as a result of insecurity and armed conflicts this past decade. The population still suffers from destruction of critical infrastructure such as medical facilities and schools. Authorities deepened their crackdown on civic groups in Tripoli, arbitrarily arresting and detaining people on vague speech accusations. Civic activist Mansour al-Maghribi remains missing after his abduction by unidentified armed men in the eastern town of Ajdabiya last year. Authorities arbitrarily detain migrants and asylum seekers who risk beatings, extortion, sexual violence, and forced labor in detention centers nominally under the state. Migrants also face abuse by armed groups and smugglers. In this context, the mandate of the FFM remains crucial to ensuring comprehensive review of the situation in Libya, and we urge the Council to ensure its renewal in full in June. Thank you.
Thank you. Por favor, tratemos de mantener el tiempo acordado. International Commission of Jurists.
Mr. President, the International Commission of Jurists and Lawyers for Justice in Libya remain extremely concerned by the dire human rights situation in Libya. As highlighted by the fact-finding mission last October, serious human rights violations continue to be committed, including crimes against humanity against Libyans, migrants, and refugees throughout the country. The prospects for Libya are even bleaker. Renewed conflict remains a real possibility, and impunity continues to prevail. In June 2020, this Council established the FFM to help strengthening accountability in Libya, which is essential to secure enduring stability and peace. However, the FFM has not been given adequate time or resources to conduct a comprehensive investigation into human rights violations in the country. In October 2021, this Council renewed the FFM's mandate for a period of 9 months only, thus failing to provide the FFM with sufficient additional time to adequately fulfill its mission. The FFM mandate is due to expire in June this year, at a time where Libya faces a critical transition process. This Council must commit to support accountability efforts in the country and be resolute in renewing the FFM's mandate for at least 2 years. This will allow the FFM to conduct its investigation effectively and to fulfill its mandate. I thank you.
Thank you. World Organization Against Torture.
The UMCT and the Libyan Anti-Torture Network welcome the report of the fact-finding mission in Libya. We are extremely troubled by the opening in early 2022 of 2 new detention centers for migrants in Tripoli, despite documented evidence of serious human rights violations being carried out in similar facilities across the country. We are deeply concerned about the expansion of the Stability Support Apparatus mandate, which will include managing detention centers and sending migrants that have been intercepted at sea to remote informal detention locations in the Al-Maya area. These detention locations, which fall outside the jurisdiction of the Department for Combating Illegal Immigration, are inaccessible to local and international humanitarian organizations. The Libyan Anti-Torture Network gathered numerous testimonies of torture and other human rights violations that occurred in these detention locations, where it has been reported that thousands of migrants of different nationalities, including women and children, are being held in inhuman conditions. We call on Libya to take all necessary steps to protect migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers from torture and other ill treatment, including by private militias, guarantee access to detention centers for humanitarian organizations, immediately release the most vulnerable groups of migrants, especially children, and hold accountable those responsible for human rights violations. We call on the international community to suspend all cooperation with the government of Libya, pending its full compliance with international human rights and international humanitarian law.
Thank you. Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies.
Mr. President, civil society organizations in Libya are witnessing unprecedented attacks since 2011. Libyan authorities are planning to exterminate all independent human rights associations in the country. These associations are the main reference to the UN-established FFM, and their closure would undermine the work of the UN body. The closure of this organization is part of a widespread and systematic plan to repress and control freedom of expression and association, using the very restrictive laws issued during the Gaddafi era to eliminate critical voices and threaten peaceful opposition. The executive use a political understanding between internal security service and radical Salafist armed group such as Rada in the west and Tariq bin Ziyad in the east. Between September 2021 and March 2022, internal security service arrested at least 35 persons, among them bloggers, journalists, and peaceful protesters, mainly in Tripoli and Sirte. The charges against these individuals have a clear objective to defame and terrorize peaceful activists. Peace and process and legitimacy of upcoming election in Libya are threatened by this irresponsible action. We call on the Human Rights Council to renew the fact-finding mission on Libya at its next session and ensure it has the time, the resources required to carry out its mandate.
Thank you. Human Rights Solidarity Organization.
سيدي الرئيس، منظمة تضامن حقوق الإنسان وهي مؤسسة من المجتمع المدني الليبي طلعت على التقرير الثاني للبعثة الدولية المستقلة لتقصي الحقائق في ليبيا وتثمن عملها، ولكن في نفس الوقت تأسف أنه غفل عن توثيق عدد من الانتهاكات الجسيمة لحقوق الإنسان مخالفة المنهجية والمعايير التي خطتها البعثة لنفسها. ومن هذه القضايا التي أغفلها التقرير التهجير القسري ومصادرة أملاك أكثر من 100,000 نسمة من سكان مدن المنطقة الشرقية مثل درنا، البيضة، بنغازي وجدابية، وهم يعانون في المنطقة الغربية من سوء المعاملة من قبل الحكومات المتعاقبة. جرائم القتل خارج نطاق القضاء لعشرات الضحايا في مدينة بنغازي وضواحيها، منها ما ارتكبها المطلوب للمحكمة الجنائية محمود الرفلي، والتي لم يشر إليها تقرير اللجنة التي أنشأها مكتب المفوض السامي في 2014. جريمة بلدة الأبيار شرق مدينة بنغازي التي راح ضحيتها 36 شخصا. منظمة التضامن تطالب البعثة باتخاذ جميع الإجراءات اللازمة حتى تتمكن من إنهاء أعمالها، والتي منها زيارة السجون والمعتقلات وتوثيق الانتهاكات داخلها، كما تدعوها إلى تحديد وتسمية كل من يعرقل عملها من جهات وأشخاص، ويعد هذا الحد الأدنى ما يمكن اعتباره. سيد الرئيس، منظمة التضامن تود تذكير مجلسكم الموقر بأن الأطراف المختلفة في ليبيا لا زالت تقترف أعمال تعد انتهاكات جسيمة للقانون الدولي في إفلات تام من العقاب. وشكرا.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Matt for Peace.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. ترحب مؤسسة معهد للسلام والتنمية وحقوق الإنسان بتمديد عمل البعثة الدولية المستقلة لتقصي الحقائق في ليبيا لمدة 9 أشهر قادمة، ونود بأن نشكر اللجنة على تعاونها مع منظمات المجتمع المدني، إلا أن مؤسسة معهد تستنكر تعذر إجراء الانتخابات الرئاسية في ليبيا التي كان مقرر إجراءها في ديسمبر الماضي. وتؤكد مؤسسة معهد أن تأجيل الانتخابات يرجع إلى عدد من الأسباب، من بينها انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان التي تزامنت مع التحضير لإجرائها، والحالة السائدة من الإفلات من العقاب، وعدم المساءلة التي شاعت في غرب ليبيا، لا سيما مع استمرار تواجد قوات المرتزقة والقوات الأجنبية في تعارض فج مع قرارات مجلس الأمن ومخرجات مؤتمر برلين. لقد زادت الميليشيات المسلحة في طرابلس من الممارسات التعسفية ضد المعارضين والمدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان ونشطاء الرأي والعاملين في المجتمع المدني، وارتفعت القيود المفروضة على حرية الرأي والتعبير بما في ذلك حرية الصحافة، فيما استفحلت الممارسات التعسفية التي مارسها المخلفون بتنفيذ القانون ضد المهاجرين واللاجئين في ليبيا. في هذا الصدد نكرر طلبنا بضرورة تعاون ليبيا الكامل مع البعثة المستقلة لتقصي الحقائق بشأن ليبيا والمحكمة الجنائية الدولية. شكرا سيادة الرئيس.
Thank you. Association Manoa for Human Rights and Immigration.
Thank you, President. We welcome steps taken by the Central African Republic government to promote and protect human rights, including the establishment of a special commission of inquiry to investigate violations of international humanitarian and international human rights law linked to the elections. Indeed, it's time to break Central African Republic's prolonged and worrying cycle of violence, and to that end, we call for comprehensive and effective efforts to investigate and remedy all alleged abuses. However, there's been very little justice
can we
or
stop the video,
accountability within
please?
Central African Republic.
Can we stop the video, please? Because there was a misunderstanding. It's not for this dialogue. There was a technical problem. So we move to the last speaker, Mezan, Center for Human Rights.
Thank you, President. We welcome the report of the fact-finding mission and all efforts made to investigate gross human rights violations in Libya. However, we remain deeply concerned about the humanitarian crisis in the country. For decades now, people's rights continue to be systematically violated, despite a consolidated body of international law. Children are particularly vulnerable. They are recruited to actively participate in combat and killed in hostilities. Also, their schools are being destroyed. The recruitment and use in combat effectively violate the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, as well as the CRC. Besides being recruited, children are also held in detention together with adults, only increasing the risk of being sexually exploited. Here again, we would like to emphasize, the list of findings is non-exhaustive. Children are not the only ones suffering from forced disappearances. Adults, too, are victims of gender-based violence and other grave human rights violations. The situation on the ground is likely much worse than what the findings have suggested so far. Therefore, Mizan Center and Geneva International Center for Justice call on the Council to extend the mandate of the fact-finding mission so that investigations into these and other grave human rights violations can continue. Further, we call for the creation of an independent international tribunal for international crimes and human rights violations committed in the country. We believe that the situation cannot improve if we do not hold all perpetrators accountable for their crimes. I thank you.
Thank you. Esta fue la última oradora de la lista. Ahora le doy la palabra a la señora Robinson y al señor Bellani para sus conclusiones finales. Gracias.
Thank you very much, President, and thank you to your excellencies for your questions and your observations. We particularly note the wide support for the mandate and its continuing work. We also want to acknowledge the comments and observations with gratitude from the permanent mission of Libya, which has gone to lengths to cooperate with the work of the FFM, and we particularly acknowledge Ambassador Tamim, its leader. This, as many of you have noted, is an interim or intermediate report. It follows up on our October report and precedes our June report. It reflects only a fraction of our ongoing investigations in Libya. Chiloka will return to questions and concerns raised by Libya and other states about technical assistance, as well as a repeated question as to what you can do in supporting the work of the FFM. I nevertheless point out our many recommendations and steps towards, as Netherlands put it, accountability and reconciliation, noting only for the moment before Chiloka returns to this point, that 3 of the recommendations to Libya point out the need for institution building to address violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. A half of the recommendations to the international community continue the conversation around technical assistance to support the follow-up to the findings, and all the recommendations to the UN address this question of technical assistance. Without more, and more is precisely what the FFM is hopeful about, the June report would be our final report. But this March report outlines in detail serious violations that are continuing and very present. Ambassador Tamim of Libya, in a conversation with us, said the stack of violations is growing. Indeed, as he pointed out to us, it grows for all member states. But what's different in Libya is the absence of institutions and the weakness of institutions to appropriately respond, hence the scourge of impunity. The work of the FFM is committed to a relationship which leads to possible change, and we continue to advocate for technical support and signal that the fact-finding mission is key and deeply connected to that effort. In that vein, we also echo the findings in the report that the growing stack in the absence of transition is weighing down the process of a move to democracy. And let me just say something about an oft-repeated comment of states about the narrowing of the civic space and the limits on political participation. This has impacted not just the work of the fact-finding mission, its access to witnesses and victims, but it has also affected, of course, the transition to democracy and expectations of the nearly 3 million registered voters in Libya to know. As the stack grows, the weight is chilling. In the last few months, since we were here before you in October, we have seen several persons detained, inserted by armed groups for their ostensible political views. We have seen court processes reviewing the question of eligibility to run threatened. We have seen, at least mentioned several times by others, 7 young men detained by a Tripoli-based militia for exercising their freedom of expression, and questionable confessions have appeared from them in social media. We have seen a backlash of hate speech against activists. We've seen legal and regulatory constraints against civil society through presidential decrees, requests for re-registration of civil society, and new cybercrime legislation. You've asked what measures could be taken in Switzerland to respond to this growing narrowing of the civic space, and we have suggested the immediate release of persons arbitrarily detained for their freedom of expression, the investigations of those who have violated rights, review of legislation and regulations. Let me just quickly say something in ending about women's participation, given that women are critical to peace, and note with concern the reduced numbers of women in government over the course of our mandate, and the MOU with the UN Women related to Security Resolution 1325 on peace and security, which seems now disbanded. It is clear that our mission in Libya is impacted by the current situation, but that our fact-finding could have an impact. And we continue to work in this context, recognizing the continuing concerns about political participation and transition to democracy and peace.
Sorry, is this one? Mr. President, my colleague Tracy, first of all, we wish to express our deep appreciation of the constructive statement made by the Permanent Mission of Libya at the opening of this interactive dialogue, and for their reiteration of cooperation with the FFM. We sincerely thank many distinguished representatives for their express support to the FFM and continuity of its mandate. Now is not the time to throw the baby with the bathwater. Several delegations, including the EU, US, UK, Finland, Malta, Spain, Germany, Switzerland, raised the question of how to support, how the international community can support the work of the FFM. And here, clearly, we think that it's important to support the FFM to complete the fulfillment of its mandate. The continuity of its mandate is key to this particular aspect. But there are also specific goals that the international community can support. That is strengthening the law enforcement institutions in Libya, including prosecution, investigations, strengthening an important judiciary, independent, impartial, and competent in the administration of justice, supporting independent accountability mechanisms, specifically for international crimes, both national judicial mechanisms and international accountability mechanisms. We call for the exercise of universal jurisdiction as a measure to bring perpetrators to account by individual countries, especially in the context of mercenarism, as I allude to. This, again, is possible. Supporting international monitoring of the preparation for elections in Libya to ensure that they are conducted freely and fairly without human rights violations, as my colleague Tracy has mentioned. Transition to the rule of law, human rights, and therefore peace and democracy are important ingredients along which the FFM is working at the moment. So we call for continuing support in order that we complete both our thematic and geographic mandate. We have covered eastern and western Libya. We haven't covered southern Libya so far, in order to be able to investigate violations impartially committed by all sides. We still need to look at mass graves in Tahuna, Ben Walid, and other places with forensic expertise. In addition to these particular aspects, distinguished representatives of Finland, additionally Egypt, Iraq, France, Saudi Arabia, and Morocco raised the issue of mercenarism and foreign fighters. And here we recall the OAU Convention for the Elimination of Mercenarism in Africa, 1977, which Libya happily ratified in 2005. And it does recognize that mercenaries pose a grave threat to independent sovereignty, security, territorial integrity, which is the case at the moment in Libya. The crime of mercenarism under this convention is committed by the individual, group, or association representative of a state or the state itself, with the aim of opposing by armed violence a process of self-determination, stability, or the territorial integrity of another state, in this case, of course, Libya. But this also requires technical mutual assistance between states, and in particular in relation to Libya, as envisaged by Article 10 of that convention. In terms of other measures promoting democracy, the crackdown, I think specific questions here were asked by the EU and the Swiss. And here we identified the way in which the Internal Security Agency has arrested individuals, young men in particular, exercising their right to freedom of expression, and detained them arbitrarily with no contact with the outside world. This has been corroborated by investigations by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and we therefore call upon this particular agency to comply with Libya's international human rights obligations in this respect. A number of delegations, including the Arab Group, Africa Group, Iraqi, Mauritania, and others, called for technical assistance, which we endorse, and indeed our mandate is issued under the technical assistance agenda item of the Human Rights Council. And here we, first of all, again commend the areas identified in the statement made by the permanent mission of Libya for technical support. They are in accordance with our own findings at this particular point in time. And we reiterate strengthening the prosecution investigations agency, an independent judiciary, strengthening rule of law, transitional justice, as indicated by others. And in the context of the right of Libya to control its own borders, as mentioned by the permanent mission, again here we point out to the important study by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and their report and recommendations on respecting human rights at borders, which requires technical support. Finally, we again appreciate and take note of the statements made by civil society organizations and indeed their support for the FFM, without which our work is invaluable. We are still working within our methods of approach. We have not violated them. IDPs continue to be an important part of our work. And with those remarks, I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Quiero agradecer a los miembros de la misión de determinación por su participación en este diálogo y quiero también felicitar el excelente trabajo y el espíritu de cooperación con la delegación de Libia y con el gobierno de Libia para poder trabajar en el país. Creo que es un mensaje muy constructivo de este tipo de mecanismos de asistencia técnica en permanente diálogo con las autoridades del lugar, que es un ejemplo. Así que muchas gracias. Con esto damos por finalizado el diálogo interactivo y hacemos una breve pausa técnica y continuamos con el diálogo sobre Ucrania. Gracias. Procedemos ahora al diálogo interactivo sobre la actualización oral de la alta comisionada acerca de las conclusiones del informe periódico de la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada para los Derechos Humanos sobre la situación de los derechos humanos en Ucrania, de conformidad con la resolución 47/22 del Consejo. La lista de oradores se cerrará en 15 minutos. Tengo el honor de dar la bienvenida a la señora Michelle Bachelet, Alta Comisionada de las Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos, para que presente la actualización oral. Tiene usted la palabra.
Thank you, Mr. President, distinguished President, Excellencies, colleagues and friends. The Council has received a report on Ukraine covering the period from 1st of August 2021 to 31st of January 2022, pursuant to Human Rights Council Resolution 47/22. As the context has dramatically shifted since then, my statement today will focus on the human rights and humanitarian crisis that has unfolded since the Russian armed attack began on 24 of February. For more than 1 month now, the entire population of Ukraine has been enduring a living nightmare. The lives of millions of people are in upheaval as they are forced to flee their homes or hide in basements and bomb shelters as their cities are pummeled and destroyed. I echo the Secretary General's words that, and I will quote him, "Continuing the war in Ukraine is morally unacceptable, politically undefensible, and militarily nonsensical." End of quote. The hostilities must stop without delay. Today, I call on the Russian Federation to heed the clear and strong calls of the General Assembly and of this Council and immediately act to withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory. Excellencies, in the 5 weeks since the conflict began, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has recorded at least 1,189 deaths of civilian men, women, and children, and at least 1,901 injuries. We know the actual figures are likely far higher. In many places of intensive hostilities, such as Mariupol and Volnovaya, it is very challenging to obtain a comprehensive picture. The persistent use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas is of immense concern. These weapons include missiles, heavy artillery, shells and rockets, and airstrikes, causing massive destruction of and damage to civilian objects. In addition, my office has received credible allegations that Russian armed forces have used cluster munitions in populated areas at least 24 times. We're also investigating allegations that Ukrainian armed forces have used such weapons. Homes and administrative buildings, hospitals and schools, water stations, and electricity system have not been spared. To date, we have verified 77 incidents in which medical facilities were damaged to various degrees, including 50 hospitals, 7 psychoneurological facilities, and 20 other medical facilities. Overall, 55 medical establishments were damaged, 10 destroyed, and 2 were looted. Actual numbers are again likely to be considerably higher, and reports of additional incidents are being corroborated by the Human Rights Monitoring Mission. Indiscriminate attacks are prohibited under international humanitarian law and may amount to war crimes. The massive destruction of civilian objects and the high number of civilian casualties strongly indicate that the fundamental principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution has not been sufficiently adhered to. Civilians are enduring immeasurable suffering, and the humanitarian crisis is critical. In many areas across the country, people urgently need medical supplies, food, water, shelter, and basic household items. Above all, they need the bombs to cease and the weapons to fall silent. In several besieged cities, my office has noted a significant increase in mortality rates among civilians that can be attributed to disrupted medical care, coupled with conflict-related deprivation and stress. As one woman from Kiev told my colleagues, and I will quote her, "I cannot imagine the situation of people with diabetes or those undergoing cancer treatment, for whom it is critical to regularly take medications." End of quote. People with disabilities and older people face a particularly appalling humanitarian situation. Long-term care facilities are suffering a lack of food, heating, electricity, water, and medication. Many residents who have chronic health conditions rely on others for care and are struggling to access bomb shelters or safe areas. At least one facility for bedridden patients and other people with disabilities, mostly older people, came under fire while its residents were inside, with dozens of alleged casualties. My colleagues in Ukraine are working to establish the fate and whereabouts of survivors. Moreover, displaced people with disabilities now staying at poorly equipped temporary facilities often lack access to health care and rehabilitation services. Excellencies, since the beginning of the invasion, Russian armed forces have carried out attacks and military strikes on and near large cities including Chernihiv, Kharkiv, Kherson, Mykolaiv, Severodonetsk, Sumy, and Mariupol, and the capital Kiev. In the besieged city of Mariupol, people are living in sheer terror. The situation is worsening by the day, with constant shelling, fighting in the streets, and people struggling to survive with the bare minimums of life's necessities, including food, water, and medical supplies. We are looking into allegations that some Mariupol residents have been forcibly evacuated, either to territory controlled by Russian-affiliated armed groups or to the Russian Federation. Across Ukraine, the rights to life, liberty, and security are under attack. Detentions of civilians who are vocal about their pro-Ukrainian views in territories under control of Russian forces has become widespread. My office has also received allegations of killing of 2 civilians considered to be affiliated with Russian armed forces or supporting for Russian views. There are reports of up to 350 conflict-related detentions by Ukrainian law enforcement officers, including 4 cases where the individual's relatives received no information regarding their formal arrest, place of detention, or their fate. Furthermore, I'm very concerned by the abundance of videos available through open sources depicting interrogation of prisoners of war that have been taken by both Ukrainian and Russian forces. We have also received some allegations of conflict-related sexual violence, including rape, and we're still working to corroborate them. Additionally, freedom of expression is under threat. Every day, many journalists are courageously fighting a crucial battle against mounting misinformation and propaganda, often putting their own lives at great risk. 7 journalists and media workers have been killed since hostilities began. Another 15 have come under armed attack, 9 of whom were injured. We have also documented the arbitrary detention and the possible enforced disappearance of 22 journalists and civil society activists who have been vocal against the invasion in Kiev, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions. I underscore that independent, objective reporting of the facts on the ground is absolutely vital to counter the harmful spread of misinformation and propaganda. Excellencies, the devastating consequences of this war are being felt far outside Ukraine's borders. Nearly a quarter of Ukraine's population have been forced to flee. Over 4 million people have fled the country since the attack began, and an estimated 6.5 million are internally displaced. It is encouraging to see the outpouring of support offered to refugees by Ukraine's neighbors, and other countries around the world. I reiterate that it is essential to extend such a welcome to all who have fled without discrimination. I also urge destination countries to provide particular protection to women and children, many of whom face risks of human trafficking, including sexual and labor exploitation. Additionally, a rise in Russophobia has been observed in a number of countries. My office continues to monitor all these events. As the war approaches the 6th week, I reiterate my calls for states to respect and uphold international humanitarian and human rights law. I urge humanitarian assistance to be delivered safely and effectively. All civilians must be protected, and those who wish to leave must be provided safe passage in the direction they choose. And prisoners of war must be treated with dignity and full respect for their rights. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine will continue its vital monitoring role. Despite the very difficult security context, staff in various parts of the country continue to document civilian casualties, the impact of hostilities, and violations of human rights. I take this opportunity to thank all who are working to assist the people of Ukraine. Every day, my colleagues are listening to the heartbreaking stories of Ukrainians whose lives have been shattered by this conflict. Just last week, They ask a simple question to a displaced man from a town in eastern Ukraine. Where are you from? His reply, I'm from Izium, a city that no longer exists. The terror and agony of the Ukrainian people is palpable and is being felt around the world. They want the war to stop and to return to peace, safety, and human dignity. It is long time to heed their call. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señora alta comisionada. Como seguimos nuestra práctica, vamos a comenzar por escuchar a la delegación del país concernido. Tiene la palabra la distinguida representante de Ucrania.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Madam High Commissioner, for your update, which describes in appalling details the horrors of Russia's assault on Ukraine and the war crimes committed by Russia against the Ukrainian people. A little over a month ago, Ukraine was brutally attacked by the Russian Federation in an act of unprovoked aggression against a sovereign state. This step by the country occupying a seat in the UN Security Council and in the Human Rights Council has become a flagrant violation of the UN Charter and fundamental principles of international law, which will have long-lasting implications for the future of the world order and humanity. In only a month, the Russian aggression has already had a devastating toll on human rights of the Ukrainian people. Acting on orders from the leadership, the Russian army utilizes the most vicious methods with demonstrative disregard for human life. Since the start of the invasion, Russia has launched hundreds of missiles to the residential areas, killing thousands of innocent civilians. It bombs hospitals and maternity wards, targets civilian infrastructure to deliberately deprive thousands to access of basic needs, plants bombs in children's toys while retreating from previously seized Ukrainian territories. The besieged city of Mariupol, leveled to the ground by the Russian rockets and missiles, has become a symbol of Ukrainian resistance, Russian cruelty, and human suffering. Nearly 160,000 civilians remain in blockade without water, heat, electricity, and communications. The local authorities estimate that at least 5,000 have been killed there. The Russian forces indiscriminately shell cities and humanitarian corridors, forcing civilians to flee only to its territory or to Belarus, which should be considered a forcible deportation according to international humanitarian law. An estimated 40,000 Ukrainian citizens have been trafficked in this way. Russian aggression has brought immense suffering for Ukraine's children, at least 144 of whom have been killed and 220 injured. According to UNICEF, 1 month of war in Ukraine has led to the displacement of 4.3 million children, more than half of the country's estimated 7.5 million child population. Mr. President, in the course of the last 4 weeks of the Human Rights session, the Russian Federation has been urged to immediately cease the aggression against Ukraine, and we thank the High Commissioner for reinforcing this demand today. Unfortunately, in blatant disregard and disrespect for the United Nations and this body, Russia has failed to implement any of the resolutions of the UN General Assembly and the resolution of the Human Rights Council demanding Russia to immediately cease its use of force against Ukraine, put an end to human rights violations, and stop human suffering on the ground. The magnitude and viciousness of Russia's crimes call for unified actions of the international community to ensure accountability and bring the perpetrators to justice. We hope that the work of the Commission of Inquiry established by the Council with the 3 experts nominated today will become an important element in the set of measures taken by various legal and judicial institutions to ensure there will be no impunity for Russia's war criminals. Last but not least, the OHCHR and its mission in Ukraine remain crucial instruments in monitoring the developments on the ground. We thank the Office of the High Commissioner for the publication of the latest update and count on its continuous efforts to provide regular and objective information on the human rights situation in Ukraine stemming from the Russian aggression. Let me conclude by reiterating the Russian aggression against Ukraine has been an attack on norms and principles that form the basis of international order, with human rights being its key element. The states which demonstrate such a disrespect for international law, which engages in human rights violation in such a gross and systematic manner, is not worthy of a seat in this Council. It is our common duty to stand up against the aggression and to ensure that such atrocities do not happen again anywhere in the world. I thank you.
Muchas gracias, embajadora. Invito a las delegaciones a formular preguntas a la alta comisionada y a hacer comentarios sobre el informe. Y en primer lugar, tiene la palabra Su Excelencia el señor Gabrielius Landsbergis, ministro de Asuntos Exteriores de Lituania, en nombre de un grupo de países, por video.
Mr. President, on behalf of the Nordic and Baltic countries, I thank the High Commissioner for her oral update and the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine for its work. We stand united with Ukraine facing large-scale, unprovoked, unlawful, and unjustified aggression by Russia, enabled by Belarus. We admire the courage of the Ukrainian people defending their country and legally binding norms of the international law and the principles of the United Nations Charter. We urge Russia to immediately cease the attacks and deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, especially using explosive weapons such as cluster munitions in residential areas, which are grave violations of international humanitarian law. We demand Russia to immediately and unconditionally withdraw all its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine. Russia is responsible for the bloodshed of innocent people, including women and children, and for millions of lives destroyed. All human rights violations and suspected war crimes must be investigated and accountability ensured. Accountability matters. Justice cannot be escaped. The international community must do everything to hold Russia and its accomplice Belarus to account. The Nordic Baltic countries commend the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry and call for its immediate operationalization. Madam High Commissioner, what more could be done to strengthen our efforts in seeking justice for victims and accountability for perpetrators?
Gracias. Tiene la palabra la Unión Europea.
Thank you, Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner. Ukraine is turning into a scene of devastation, with the toll of civilian casualties rising every minute. The Russian Federation continues with the indiscriminate and unrelenting bombing of civilian infrastructure. Ukraine is becoming a full-scale humanitarian catastrophe. Every day, civilians are being attacked with explosive weapons, heavy artillery, rockets, missiles, or airstrikes. They are facing unbearable physical and mental suffering, hiding in shelters, and lacking access to basic goods and services. More than 10 million people have already been forced to flee their homes and leave their beloved ones. We reiterate our condemnation in the strongest possible terms of this unprovoked and unlawful military aggression by Russia against Ukraine and its population. We urge Russia to abide by its obligations under international law and to cease its aggression and withdraw all forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine immediately and unconditionally, and to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence within its internationally recognized borders. We urge Russia to implement with immediate effect the provisional measure order rendered by the International Court of Justice on 16th of March. We reiterate that international human rights law and international humanitarian law must be fully upheld. We urge Russia to stop this war immediately. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Croacia en nombre de un grupo de países.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor of delivering this statement on behalf of the core group on casualty recording, including Costa Rica, Liechtenstein, and my own country, Croatia. We thank the High Commissioner for the update that paints a grim picture of human suffering in Ukraine. Our countries condemn the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine in flagrant violation of IHL, international human rights law, that so far has led to thousands of civilian casualties, including children. Our group has continuously reiterated the importance of comprehensive, verifiable, and transparent records of casualties in situations of armed violence and conflict, which can contribute to better protection of civilians and help prevent violations of international law. As stated on behalf of 51 countries at the 45th session of the Council, casualty recording can be used to support effective realization of numerous human rights. Mr. President, casualty records offer detailed circumstances of every person killed, which can be used for accountability, memorialization, remedies and policy decisions, including for accounting of missing persons. This is important as justice is a central component of any negotiated settlement and durable peace solution. We understand that the OHCHR believes that actual figures are considerably higher. However, we thank the Office for regularly publishing independent and verifiable data of civilian casualties in Ukraine. We call for an immediate stop of indiscriminate shelling of civilians in Ukraine by Russian forces, as such acts may amount to war crimes, being directly responsible for a rising number of civilian casualties in Ukraine. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Liechtenstein.
I would like to thank the High Commissioner for an oral update on Ukraine. We would like to reiterate our strong condemnation of the Russian military aggression against Ukraine. We are horrified by the continuation of the armed conflict and the reluctance to establish a ceasefire and to find a peaceful solution to end the conflict. Most shocking are reports of starvation as a means of warfare and shelling, as well as the use of illegal weaponry against civilians and civilian objects. Even when fleeing, civilians are not safe from brutal attacks as the Russian military continues its shelling. The granting of safe passage in both directions for those fleeing and those delivering humanitarian aid must be respected. As a result of the war, millions of Ukrainians are forcefully displaced and lack the most basic goods, including food, as well as protection and shelter. Moreover, this situation exposes in particular women and children to human trafficking and sexual slavery. The war has already caused incalculable suffering for millions of people and must end before it escalates even further. Mr. President, the Russian government needs to be held accountable for this unprovoked military aggression against Ukraine and the related war crimes and crimes against humanity. Liechtenstein has therefore been among the states that have referred the situation in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court. We reiterate our calls for a rapid de-escalation through the engagement in a constructive dialogue. We continue to stand in full solidarity with the Ukrainian people, and our government has already allocated humanitarian emergency funds to support actors on the ground. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Finlandia.
Finland aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for the latest update. Finland reiterates its strong condemnation of Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. It is a flagrant violation of international law and the UN Charter. We also condemn the involvement of Belarus in this aggression. Finland's support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity remains firm. We stand in full solidarity with Ukraine and its people. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has devastating consequences on the civilian population. Russia bears responsibility of its attacks on civilian targets. Finland urges Russia to cease its military aggression immediately and unconditionally, and to adhere to its international commitments and obligations. There is no justification for Russia's aggression, nor for the human rights violations committed during the previous 8 years in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea. Madam High Commissioner, what are your recommendations to ensure accountability for violations of human rights and humanitarian law in the context of the aggression? I thank you.
Gracias, embajadora. Tiene la palabra Alemania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Germany aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for her reports. The reports shed light on the dire human rights situation in Ukraine after the Russian aggression. The 24th of February has changed everything. Today we are confronted with a brutal military aggression by the Russian Federation against the whole of Ukraine. Every day we receive reports on the most serious violations of international law. Attacks on innocent civilians, women and children constitute war crimes. They must stop immediately. Relevant incidents must be thoroughly investigated and those responsible must be held account. The truth is the first victim in every war. However, the lies and distortion of Russia were particularly striking. Let me state it very clearly. There were no signs of a genocide committed against the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine. Moreover, there is no program for the development of weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine. And there is not a shadow of a doubt that it is not Ukraine forces which are shelling its own people, its own civilian infrastructure. We stand in solidarity with Ukraine and its people against the Russian aggression, against Putin's war. Madam High Commissioner, how can the international community support accountability? Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la Soberana Orden de Malta.
Mr. President, my delegation thanks the High Commissioner for her comprehensive update. The Sovereign Order of Malta condemns any form of aggression of sovereign states and is deeply concerned by the current war in Ukraine. The tragic situation has forced 4 million people to flee the country while causing the internal displacement of up to 6 million persons. The Order of Malta, through its worldwide relief agency, has provided food support and medical assistance to some 300,000 people at border crossings. Thousands of volunteers of the Order work tirelessly to assist the refugees in Ukraine itself, more specifically in Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk, Hungary, Poland, Romania and Slovakia. In addition to relief operations in the neighboring countries, many of the Order of Malta's associations in Austria, Germany, France and Italy, for instance, are contributing to the collection and transport of relief goods and are providing accommodation to thousands of refugees. It is essential to reaffirm her that all impacted civilian populations, from women and children to journalists, humanitarian and medical personnel, deserve the right to safety, voluntary and unhindered passage. Next to the imperative respect of international humanitarian law, refugees and IDPs must be given assistance and protection in full respect of their basic human rights, without discrimination on grounds of race, belief, gender, disability or other status. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Montenegro.
Thank the High Commissioner for the important update. Russia's unjustified and unprovoked military invasion of Ukraine has created the fastest growing humanitarian crisis in decades, with almost a quarter of Ukraine's population forced to flee homes and the country. In a month, thousands of civilians were killed and injured. Russia continues to besiege, shell and airstrike Ukraine's densely populated sites. What's more, deliberate, indiscriminate attacks on civilians and the basic civilian infrastructure, as well as strikes on nuclear power plants and the use of explosive weapons and methods of warfare in a manner that causes excessive injury or unnecessary human suffering and destruction, contravene international humanitarian law and could constitute war crimes. With this brutal war of aggression, Russia is grossly violating the most fundamental tenets of international law, the rules-based international order and the UN Charter. It is the gravest assault on the very foundation of European and global stability and security in decades. We recall the 16 March ruling of the International Court of Justice requesting Russia to comply with the provisional measures order and immediately and unconditionally stop its military actions and withdraw its forces from the entire territory of Ukraine. We also support investigation of all alleged violations and abuses of human rights, international humanitarian law, and relating crimes of this war. Those responsible must be held to account. Montenegro stands by the courageous people of Ukraine and its democratically elected authorities and reiterates its unwavering support and commitment to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
Thank you. Informo que la lista está cerrada, la lista de oradores. Tiene la palabra la embajadora de Estonia.
Mr. President, Estonia fully aligns with the statement delivered by the EU.
Due to the Russian unprovoked, unjustified and unlawful aggression against Ukraine, the world is witnessing one of the fastest growing refugee crises in history. Over 10 million people have been forced to leave their homes. Near 4 million have left Ukraine. More than half of the refugees are children. The Russian armed forces continue to bomb Ukrainian cities, killing innocent people, including women and children, and destroying civilian infrastructure, including the orphanages, kindergartens, schools and hospitals. Numerous attempts to evacuate the remaining civilian population from the war zone have been disrupted by Russian deliberate shelling. Ukraine is becoming a full-scale humanitarian catastrophe. We strongly condemn the recruitment of residents of the Donetsk, Luhansk and Crimea regions into the Russian army and their use in the war against Ukraine. We reiterate that Russia has committed the human rights violations during the previous 8 years in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea, including violations against Crimean Tatars. The failure of the Russian army in the planned blitzkrieg has become an act of revenge by the occupying forces against the people of Ukraine. Russia's actions in Ukraine have all the characteristics of war crimes and crimes against humanity. We urge Russia to end this war and violations of humanitarian and human rights law. Madam High Commissioner, to what extent can human rights organizations in the current situation monitor and document the gross and massive human rights violations committed by the Russian Federation in Ukraine to ensure accountability for these violations? I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Japón.
Thank you. Our hearts go out to all victims and the survivors, including children, women, journalists, and medical and humanitarian personnel in Ukraine. Japan condemns in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which seriously infringes upon Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. We condemn all the violations by IHL and the violation and abuse of human rights, and call upon Russia to fulfill its obligation under international law, including international human rights law and IHL. Let us unite to firmly defend the foundation of the international order. Japan stands together with the citizens of Ukraine who are doing their utmost to defend their sovereignty and territory, as well as their homeland and their families. To this end, we recently announced our commitment to providing an additional $100 million in emergency humanitarian assistance for Ukraine and its neighbors. We will also take steps to provide assistance for the acceptance of displaced persons into Japan. Specifically, we will establish a support team in Poland for this purpose. We will continue to provide all possible support to the Ukrainian people going forward. We will continue to make every effort to improve the situation in cooperation with the international community, including G7, while standing with Ukraine and its people. I thank you.
Thank you. Je donne la parole à la France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Madame la Haute-Commissaire, la France vous remercie pour votre rapport particulièrement opportun et, il faut l'avouer, terrifiant. Cette guerre résulte d'une invasion. Il y a d'un côté l'agresseur et de l'autre un peuple qui se défend, nous ne l'oublions pas. Tandis que l'agression militaire injustifiable, illégale et non provoquée lancée le 24 février 2022 par la Russie se poursuit, la situation en Ukraine ne cesse de se détériorer. Le nombre de victimes civiles augmente chaque jour. La France condamne les attaques indiscriminées commises contre les infrastructures et les populations civiles. Le siège des villes, à commencer par Mariupol, où la population est littéralement prise en otage par les forces russes. Tout cela en violation flagrante du droit international humanitaire. La Cour internationale de justice l'a demandé, nous le réitérons. La Russie doit suspendre immédiatement ses opérations militaires en Ukraine. Face à cette tragédie, la France réaffirme son soutien au mandat du Haut-Commissariat en Ukraine. Sa présence sur place a démontré toute son utilité pour disposer d'informations fiables, impartiales et indiscutables, notamment sur le nombre de victimes civiles. Nous nous félicitons de la création de la commission d'enquête indépendante qui permettra de documenter les violations graves et systématiques des droits de l'homme résultant de l'agression russe et espérons qu'elle sera bientôt en mesure de travailler sur le terrain. L'impunité n'est pas une option. Les auteurs d'atrocités commises dans le cadre de cette agression devront être poursuivis. La France soutient le travail de la Cour pénale internationale qui a ouvert une enquête sur la situation en Ukraine le 2 mars 2022. La guerre en Ukraine a révélé le courage des autorités et du peuple ukrainien qui fait preuve d'une résistance admirable en dépit des souffrances, des disparitions, des destructions. La France se tient à leur côté et poursuivra l'appui humanitaire aux personnes affectées par le conflit, dont 4 millions de réfugiés et 6,5 millions de déplacés. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Pediría a las delegaciones, por favor, tratar de mantener el tiempo acordado para ser equitativos con aquellos que participan por video, que no pueden subir el video si no tienen el tiempo exacto. Así que para ser equitativos les voy a agradecer el esfuerzo de circunscribirse a 1 minuto 30 segundos. Venezuela tiene la palabra.
Gracias, presidente. El tema 10 de la agenda del Consejo de Derechos Humanos fue muy bien concebido para abordar la asistencia técnica y el fomento de la capacidad con el concurso del país concernido, para así contribuir a mejorar la situación de los derechos humanos mediante el diálogo genuino y la cooperación, pilares fundamentales de las labores de este Consejo. Lamentamos que bajo este tema se promuevan iniciativas totalmente alejadas de estos claros parámetros, abonando el camino de la politización de nuestras labores, que hicieron sucumbir a la extinta Comisión de Derechos Humanos. Reiteramos que las iniciativas fundadas en las motivaciones signadas por la politización, la selectividad y los dobles estándares en nada contribuyen a la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos en el mundo y no prestan ningún beneficio en favor de las personas ni los grupos vulnerables. Reafirmamos la necesidad de defender los derechos humanos universales, indivisibles, interdependientes e interrelacionados de manera constructiva y sobre la base del diálogo genuino y la cooperación, por lo que rechazamos que se utilicen espacios tan cuidados del Consejo, como es el caso del tema 10 de la agenda, con fines muy diferentes para los cuales fueron creados. Las cuestiones de derechos humanos deben ser abordadas en este Consejo con transparencia, objetividad e imparcialidad, y con pleno respeto a los propósitos y principios consagrados en la Carta de Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. Je donne la parole à Luxembourg.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Luxembourg s'associe à la déclaration présentée par l'Union européenne et remercie Madame la Haute Commissaire pour son rapport oral. Cela fait plus d'un mois que la Russie poursuit sa guerre d'agression et de dévastation en Ukraine. Chaque jour, nous sommes témoins de nouvelles horreurs. Bombardements continus et ciblés de zones d'habitation, attaques contre les hôpitaux, des écoles, destruction intentionnelle d'infrastructures civiles. Ces violations des droits humains et du droit international nous sont rapportées à travers le travail crucial et dangereux et courageux en même temps de la mission d'observation des droits de l'homme de l'ONU que nous soutenons pleinement. Depuis 8 ans, cette mission d'observation nous a fait part des violations répétées des droits humains perpétrées par la Russie. Depuis 8 ans, nous avons à maintes reprises dénoncé les violations graves et systématiques des droits humains, notamment en Crimée et au Donbass, uniquement pour nous heurter à présent à l'intransigeance russe. À présent, depuis un mois, nous assistons à une tragédie humanitaire désastreuse. Chaque jour qui passe accroît le nombre d'innocentes victimes, y inclut femmes, enfants et personnes âgées. Nous appelons à la Russie à respecter pleinement les principes du droit humanitaire et à permettre l'accès sans entrave des acteurs humanitaires aux personnes en cas de besoin. Chaque État, en vertu de la Charte des Nations Unies, s'est engagé à respecter les obligations inaliénables. Tant que les hommes, femmes et enfants ukrainiens ne sauront échapper aux répréhensibles attaques d'artillerie et de missiles russes, le gouvernement russe n'assume manifestement pas ses propres engagements. Il revient donc à la communauté internationale de rappeler le caractère immuable de ses obligations et de continuer à dénoncer les exactions de la Russie tant qu'elle n'assume pas ses responsabilités. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Una vez más pido circunscribirse al tiempo, por favor. La distinguida embajadora de España tiene la palabra.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. España agradece el informe de la alta comisionada y toma nota con consternación de la situación humanitaria y de los derechos humanos en Ucrania tras la invasión rusa que describe en su actualización oral. España se alinea con la declaración de la Unión Europea y sigue respaldando las peticiones de acceso libre, pleno y sin condiciones para la oficina de la alta comisionada en cumplimiento de las resoluciones de la Asamblea General reiteradas y suscritas por gran parte de la comunidad internacional. Mi delegación hace un llamamiento a la Federación Rusa para que ponga fin a la agresión que es la causante de esta situación. España apoya la labor de vigilancia de la misión de monitoreo de los derechos humanos en Ucrania. Confiamos en que la documentación de estas violaciones que realiza la misión y los esfuerzos de la recientemente creada Comisión Internacional Independiente de Investigación sirvan para que rindan cuentas quienes son responsables de esta situación. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra Países Bajos.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU. Former UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld once said, "You can only hope to find a lasting solution to a conflict if you have learned to see the other objectively." I have tried, Mr. President. I've really tried to see both sides. But I simply cannot comprehend why, day after day, Ukrainian neighborhoods, schools and hospitals are hit by Russian bombs and shells, with innocent civilians suffering the devastating consequences. But then again, many of the Russian people may not know what is being done in their name. Mr. President, this war not only affects Ukraine and Europe, it's a threat to the international legal order. The Russian Federation bears full responsibility for the suffering of the Ukrainian people. Edmund Burke once said, "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good people do nothing." We cannot allow the crimes committed to go unpunished, because impunity destroys the foundations on which our fundamental right rests. Therefore, we strongly support the mandate of the UN Commission of Inquiry aimed at gathering and preserving evidence. My question to the High Commissioner: journalists and media workers, individual investigators and human rights defenders are facing immense risks to keep their country and the world informed. In your view, how can we best support them? Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la Suisse.
Monsieur le Président, la Suisse remercie le Haut-Commissariat aux droits de l'homme et la mission de surveillance des droits de l'homme en Ukraine pour leur travail essentiel de documentation qui contribue à renforcer la reddition des comptes et même, le cas échéant, à prévenir les violations des droits de l'homme. La Suisse appelle la Russie à cesser immédiatement toutes les hostilités et à retirer ses troupes du territoire ukrainien, seul moyen de mettre fin aux violations du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme. Nous sommes fortement préoccupés par la situation humanitaire, les risques encourus pour la population civile et les déplacements de millions de personnes. La Suisse appelle toutes les parties au strict respect du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme. Les images d'hôpitaux, des maternités, d'écoles, d'installations d'eau et d'assainissement, ainsi que de bâtiments résidentiels détruits, soulèvent de sérieuses questions quant au respect du droit international humanitaire. Nous condamnons également les disparitions forcées et les arrestations arbitraires par les forces russes en Ukraine de personnes qui expriment leurs oppositions à l'agression militaire russe, notamment lors de manifestations pacifiques, ainsi que de journalistes et de défenseurs et défenseuses de droits de l'homme. Nous appelons à leur libération immédiate et inconditionnelle. Monsieur le Président, comment soutenir la mission de surveillance des droits de l'homme afin qu'elle puisse continuer à surveiller et documenter efficacement la situation en Ukraine? Je vous remercie.
Merci. Tiene la palabra Noruega.
Thank you, Mr. President. Russia's invasion of Ukraine with the assistance of Belarus is an unprovoked and illegal attack on a peaceful neighbor. It is a clear and unacceptable violation of international law. Norway condemns Russia's brutal attack on Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. Russia's aggressive action are a clear violation of Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity. Russia's military aggression is leading to widespread human rights violations, indiscriminate shelling of populated areas, as well as targeted attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are causing death, suffering and destruction. Journalists and human rights activists have been detained in regions under the control of Russian forces. 7 journalists have been killed during the war. The safety of journalists must be respected, and we would like to ask the High Commissioner how safety of journalists can be further strengthened. The abductions of elected officials by Russian forces must also come to an end. Mr. President, Norway welcomes the appointment of the International Commission of Inquiry earlier today. It should start its work as soon as possible. Documentation and evidence are important for possible legal proceedings in the future. Those responsible for human rights violations must be held accountable. Norway reiterates its call on Russia to end its war against Ukraine and withdraw all troops immediately. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Lituania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Lithuania thanks the High Commissioner for the oral update and the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine for its continuous work on the ground in these very difficult circumstances. Lithuania strongly supports Ukraine and its people, standing heroically in defense of their country and of the international rules-based order. As we heard outlined by the High Commissioner, the toll of civilian casualties is alarmingly rising. the intensive and wide-scale hostilities have caused mass displacement of the civilian population. Indiscriminate attacks by the Russian military target Ukrainian schools, hospitals, residential areas, civilians, including children, and continue deepening the humanitarian and human rights catastrophe with far-reaching consequences across the globe. These violations are even more grave as they are perpetrated by the member of this Council. Lithuania calls on Russia to stop this war and withdraw all forces from the entire territory of Ukraine immediately and unconditionally. International community must act united in ensuring that Russia and its accomplice Belarus is held to account for this brutal aggression. In this context, we support the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry, which is an important but only first step towards accountability in this body. Madam High Commissioner, what other accountability instruments could be used in reaction to Russia's war against Ukraine? I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Austria.
Madam High Commissioner, I wish to once again express Austria's full solidarity with Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainian people. Austria condemns the military aggression by Russia against Ukraine in the strongest terms and urges President Putin to stop this illegal war. We are appalled and shocked at the scale of human suffering that this war has caused in only a month. 10 million people have been displaced. Over 1,000 civilians have died in indiscriminate or deliberate attacks, some of which amount to war crimes. Schools and hospitals are being bombed, explosive weapons used in populated areas and cluster munitions deployed, with devastating impacts for the civilian population, particularly the most vulnerable. And thousands of people have allegedly been forcibly deported from their homes. Madam High Commissioner, perpetrators of these crimes must and will be held accountable. Austria therefore fully supports the swift establishment of this Council's Commission of Inquiry and other ongoing international efforts. And we strongly encourage you to continue your crucial reporting on the situation in Ukraine. In this regard, how are you planning to ensure that the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine can continue its important work under these current circumstances? I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra la Federación Rusa.
Господин председатель, крайне обеспокоенный и озабоченный массовыми нарушениями украинскими военными международного гуманитарного права и прав человека. В Мариуполе боевики националистических батальонов «Азов» и «Правый сектор» обстреливали беженцев, которые пытались выехать из города в сторону России. Огневые точки размещались в домах мирных жителей, которых выселяли на улицу или уничтожали. Там же боевики использовали 150 идущих перед ними мирных граждан в качестве живого щита. 2 марта в Мариуполе боевики батальона «Азов» свезли местных жителей на территорию заминированного завода «Азовсталь». Планировался подрыв завода с последующим обвинением России в уничтожении гражданского населения. 13 марта в Никольском при отступлении батальона «Айдар» взяты в заложники 300 мирных жителей. 14 марта в результате удара кассетным боеприпасом по центру Донецка погиб 21 мирный житель, 36 человек получили ранения. Жертв этой атаки могло быть в десятки раз больше. Просто сработала только одна из 50 кассет. 15 марта ВСУ обстреляли шахту в Донецке, когда под землей находились 294 человека. Нацбатальоны и украинские военные пытают пленных. На имеющихся в открытом доступе видеозаписях из-под Харькова безоружным россиянам простреливают ноги. На головах у них пакеты, кто-то без сознания. В школе Мариуполя, где размещались украинские боевики, найдено тело девушки. Ее долго пытали. На животе вырезана свастика, руки оторваны. Все эти зверства по отношению к мирным жителям осуществляются с использованием поставляемого странами Запада вооружения. Призываем Верховного комиссара и УКПЧ дать оценку этим фактам. Благодарю за внимание.
Спасибо. Tiene la palabra Australia. Australia tiene la palabra. Seguimos. Suecia.
Mr. President, Sweden fully aligns itself with the EU and thanks the High Commissioner for her report. Sweden stands in full solidarity with Ukraine and its people and will continue to united efforts of support. We condemn the Russian Federation's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine in the strongest terms. It is a flagrant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. We also condemn the involvement of Belarus in the aggression. As we speak, Ukrainians lose their homes, their loved ones and their lives as a result of the aggression. Millions are fleeing, leaving everything behind. Russia must respect international humanitarian law. Attacks against civilians by the Russian armed forces must stop. Detentions of democratically elected officials and violence against peaceful protesters are appalling and utterly unacceptable. The Geneva Convention provides that journalists are entitled to all rights and protections granted to civilians in international armed conflict. We call upon Russia to immediately respect this obligation. We are appalled by reports of sexual assaults and rapes perpetrated by Russian armed forces against Ukrainian women and girls. Sweden condemns all acts of sexual violence in conflict. All violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law must be systematically documented and investigated. Accountability must be ensured. Madam High Commissioner, what can be done to follow up on the reports of sexual violence by the Russian armed forces? Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Irlanda. Embajador, tiene la palabra.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ireland aligns with the EU statement and we thank the High Commissioner for her report. Ireland restates our firm commitment to the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognised borders. The Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol are inherently part of Ukraine, and the occupation by Russia since 2014 has been an illegal violation of Ukrainian sovereignty. Ireland also recognises Donetsk and Luhansk as integral parts of Ukraine. We unequivocally again condemn Russia's invasion as further violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity and remain gravely concerned by the human rights and humanitarian situation it has caused. This illegal and unjustified invasion has resulted in thousands of civilian casualties, destruction of critical infrastructure and wide-scale forced displacement. The situation of women and girls forced to flee is particularly worrying as they face increased vulnerability to sexual and gender-based violence. We are alarmed by the rapidly increasing suffering and humanitarian need across Ukraine, including adequate food, safe water, life-saving medicines and health services. We urge all parties to ensure safe corridors for evacuation of civilians and delivery of vital humanitarian assistance. Ireland commends the bravery of journalists and media workers who continue to report in such dangerous circumstances despite the very real threat to their lives. Madam High Commissioner, in your view, how can the international community best address serious human rights concerns in the midst of the terrible war in Ukraine? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Belarus. Embajador, tiene la palabra.
Долгие годы обсуждение ситуации в Украине политизировалось. Редко кто в этом зале вспоминал про минские договоренности и призывал их добросовестно выполнять. Текущие события в Украине стали следствием в том числе безразличного отношения Совета к проблемам, о которых сообщала мониторинговая миссия УВКПЧ. Эта дискуссия повторяет ошибки прошлого. Сейчас важны не агрессивные заявления, а усилия, которые будут нацелены на то, чтобы содействовать скорейшему политико-дипломатическому урегулированию конфликта в Украине. Мы обеспокоены ухудшением гуманитарной ситуации в стране и жертвами среди мирного населения. Мы также обеспокоены удержанием гражданских против их воли в зонах боевых действий. Западные страны позорно замалчивают этот факт. Сожалеем, что украинские власти отказали в организации гуманитарного коридора в сторону Беларуси для возвращения наших граждан. Нетерпима является ситуация с недобровольным удержанием белорусских водителей, незаконным захватом белорусских автопоездов и железнодорожных составов. Призываем Киев выполнять обязательства, в том числе по Гаагской и Женевской конвенциям. Наконец, отдельным странам, которые вновь ассоциируют Беларусь с конфликтом в Украине, хотим сказать: не пытайтесь, господа, на нас перекладывать ответственность за свои недальновидные шаги, включая поставку летального оружия и наемников в зону конфликта, которые уж точно не приблизят мир на украинской земле. И последнее. Послушав заявление, мы призываем Верховного комиссара начать борьбу с русофобией уже в этом зале. Благодарю вас.
Спасибо. Tiene la palabra Dinamarca.
Thank you, Mr. President. Denmark aligns itself with the statement made by the EU. We thank the High Commissioner for her update. Denmark condemns in the strongest possible terms Russia's deliberate and indiscriminate targeting of civilians in this unlawful and immoral war of conquest, which serves no other purpose and pursues no other principle than the naked quest for power. We must and we will ensure that evidence of violations of international humanitarian law, including war crimes and of human rights violations and abuses, is collected and preserved, and that the perpetrators are held to account. Denmark welcomes the ICC investigation and the establishment by this Council of a commission of inquiry to investigate all alleged violations of human rights in this context. We urge Russia to immediately cease its military aggression and fully respect Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, unity and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Madam High Commissioner, how can the international community facilitate safe and unhindered access of humanitarian assistance and secure humanitarian corridors to all parts of Ukraine? I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Eslovaquia.
Thank you, President. Slovakia fully aligns itself with the statement of the European Union, and we thank Madam High Commissioner for the update. As well, we would like to echo our special thanks to her team, the monitoring mission in Ukraine, for its work and devotion to keep us up to date. It is hard not to see how the reporting of the mission has changed. It is about killing, death, destruction. We feel and see the horrors of the war firsthand as a neighboring country. The report from last Friday shows also a wide range of human rights violations that should have no place in the 21st century. All those as a result of unprovoked military aggression of Russia against Ukraine. Once again, we call upon Russia to stop this war immediately. We are saddened that according to the mission, 7 journalists paid the highest price for showing us the true face of this cynically called special operation. Madam High Commissioner, Slovakia wants to reassure our full support to your work in and for Ukraine. Our recent voluntary contribution was aimed to support you in this serious and responsible task. We believe that with your monitoring and inquiry work in Ukraine, the justice will be served. It will bring all violators to justice and hopefully prevent any similar situation to happen again. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Estados Unidos de América.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for the strength of your report, Madam High Commissioner. The United States appreciates the OHCHR's ongoing work in Ukraine as President Putin continues his brutal, unprovoked, and premeditated invasion. Russia's war has caused needless death, including the deaths of children and suffering of civilians. We are horrified by Russia's tactics. They have killed the most vulnerable in this war: pregnant women at a maternity hospital, babies, and civilians desperately trying to flee. We deplore attacks harming journalists and condemn the killings of media workers. We are deeply concerned for the safety of vulnerable communities in Ukraine who may be targeted for violence or repression. We are especially alarmed by reports of abductions of civilians by Russia's forces, including at least 3 Ukrainian mayors, and forced deportations to Russia of Ukraine's civilians. We recall that Russia's human rights abuses on Ukrainian territory are not new. Since 2014, Russia has held political prisoners and ruthlessly suppressed dissent in Crimea, while troubling reports persist of arbitrary or incommunicado detention and torture in Russia-controlled areas of the Donbas. All of this invasion must stop. Madam High Commissioner, what more can we do to protect vulnerable communities in Ukraine in the face of Russia's abject aggression, and how can we promote accountability for violations of international law? I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Bélgica.
President,
a so-called genocide of Russian speakers in Donbass has been used as a pretext for war, while no single independent source for years on end has been able to confirm these claims. Today, millions of Ukrainians stand in unity and defend their right to independence and their right to live against all odds. After weeks of military exercises, Russian troops used Belarus as a launching pad to invade Ukraine. Russian missile launchers stationed on its territory were shooting at Ukrainian targets. Still, Minsk denies it had anything to do with the invasion of its neighbor. Invasions wrapped in disinformation bring back many unhappy memories on the European continent. But there are also important differences with the situation 80 years ago. And one of them is observation. Observation not only through advanced satellite imagery of facts on the ground, objective observers from the multilateral system writ large, including mandate holders and mechanisms created by this Council, were and are watching. As we speak, evidence of war crimes and human rights violations is being collected. The Commission of Inquiry created by this Council will contribute to this effort in a professional and impartial manner. Truth and justice will ultimately prevail. Effective multilateralism combats disinformation. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Rumania.
Mr. President, Romania aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for her oral update on the situation of the human rights in Ukraine. From the outset, we want to denounce the serious violations committed during the unfolding war. It is with deep sorrow for the loss of lives and destroyed destinies that we are witnessing now to one of the most alarming situations of human rights and international law violations in Europe since the World War II. This unjustified, unprovoked and unlawful military attack by Russian Federation against the sovereign Ukraine continues after so many days and nights of devastation, brutality, human tragedy and humanitarian catastrophe. We strongly condemn this flagrant violation of international law, international humanitarian law, principles of the international rules-based order, and core human rights and humanitarian values. We reiterate our strong support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders and call on Russia to immediately and unconditionally cease the aggression and withdraw completely from the entire Ukrainian territory. No war has winners. We remain committed to continue supporting Ukraine by all available means. We cooperate with international partners, organizations and civil society to ensure that persons seeking shelter are safe at all times and their fundamental human rights are guaranteed according to international legal standards. Romanian authorities and citizens continue to receive with open arms and hearts our neighbors fleeing the war and remain ready to accompany them in this traumatizing, unjust experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Reino Unido.
Yes, Senor Presidente. High Commissioner, thank you for your harrowing update. It's clear that President Putin is hell-bent on reducing Ukraine's towns and cities to dust. Thousands of people, including children, have lost their lives as he resorts to indiscriminate bombing to achieve his aims with complete disregard for human rights. We are appalled by the growing number of innocent civilians, including journalists and local government representatives, being subjected to abduction and deportation by Russian forces. Local politicians and civil society actors are fundamental to a democratic society, and it's contemptible that Russia has taken steps against them. Mr. President, the Kremlin has spent 8 years denying its abuses and violations in Crimea. This afternoon in this Council, it is again seeking to hide its egregious actions in Ukraine behind a litany of lies and a deluge of disinformation. The new Commission of Inquiry is an important step to investigate and record the reality of Russia's abuses and violations. Accountability matters. The truth matters. But it's not enough. The only way to end the immense suffering caused by Russia's unprovoked assault is for Russia to end its aggression and withdraw its troops. High Commissioner, how can the international community best support Ukrainian communities who are directly affected by Russia's aggression? Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Turquía.
Mr. President, Turkey has always supported Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, including Crimea. We reject breaches of fundamental principles of the UN Charter, first and foremost, changing of borders by use of force. Therefore, we reject the military aggression on Ukraine. The situation in Ukraine is a source of immense suffering for its people. Millions are displaced, thousands lost their loved ones and their homes. Millions more are in need of urgent humanitarian aid. From the very beginning, Turkey has mobilized its diplomatic efforts to secure a comprehensive ceasefire to stop the suffering of the Ukrainian people. We are glad to host the negotiations in Istanbul and Antalya. It is everybody's interest to achieve a ceasefire and peace as soon as possible. Every single life claimed, every building destroyed is a great loss for our common future. Mr. President, on the humanitarian front, we continue to deliver humanitarian aid to Ukraine. We also continue to support and facilitate UN aid operations launched from Turkey. We are actively working on with the UN and other agencies on civilian evacuations, for example, from Mariupol. Our support for Ukraine is not mere words, but many deeds. If needed, we are ready to facilitate any further efforts to find a peaceful way out of this situation. Turkey never has and never will refrain from undertaking its responsibilities for peace and stability in its region and beyond. I thank you.
Teşekkürler, embajador. Tiene la palabra República Checa.
Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner, I wish to thank the High Commissioner for her report on surreal nightmare becoming the new normal for millions of innocent Ukrainians. The ongoing, unprovoked, full-scale Russian military invasion of Ukraine is an unprecedented violation of all principles of international law, the UN Charter and human rights, and it is a slap in the face of humanity. The situation in Ukraine is horrendous. Russia's indiscriminate shelling of cities, including Kiev and Kharkiv, is aimed at terrorizing and demoralizing the local population. Civilians are trapped in besieged cities. Elderly, adults and children are deprived of their personal security and dignity, in many cases freezing, hiding in the shelters and basements, having no food or clean water. Russian rockets and bombs regularly hit civilian cities, including residential buildings, hospitals and schools. The population of Mariupol has been critically suffering for several weeks by now. We once again highlight that the ongoing violations of international humanitarian law constitute responsibility under international criminal law. We urge Russia to immediately end the unprovoked and unjustified attack, end the violence, withdraw its forces from Ukraine, and allow a safe and unhindered humanitarian access. Madam High Commissioner, could you give us some more detailed information about reported targeted attacks on civil society activists on territories occupied by Russia? I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Albania.
Mr. President, 5 weeks into Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, the death toll and human suffering continue to rise. More than 3,000 recorded civilian casualties, more than 4 million refugees, more than 10 million people displaced, arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances, towns and villages razed to the ground, indiscriminate attacks directed against civilians and civilian objects. In Mariupol, the month-long siege shows how Russia is using starvation as a weapon of war. The brutality of Russia's premeditated, unprovoked, and unjustified attack on the people of Ukraine continues. This complete disregard for civilian life goes hand in hand with the willful violation of the UN Charter and every principle of international law, including international human rights and humanitarian law. The people of Ukraine are enduring a living hell. Russia's violence must stop. We are grateful to the UN High Commissioner's Office, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and the many brave journalists and media workers for reporting on the horrific human suffering that Russia's unconscionable war is inflicting on the people of Ukraine. This is a human rights and humanitarian catastrophe of Russia's making. Its full extent may not yet be known, but those responsible for the international crimes committed following Russia's invasion of Ukraine must and will be held to account. Albania welcomes today's appointment of the 3 experts of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. Their work is indispensable to advance accountability in Ukraine. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Croacia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Madam High Commissioner, for your important update. Croatia aligns with EU statement. Croatia joined the world in strong condemnation of the Russian unprovoked and unjustified military aggression against Ukraine. We commend the brave people of Ukraine for defending their country and their wish to live in democracy and freedom. Croatia understands the meaning of defending one's homeland, as we too have paid a high price for our independence. We therefore fully support sovereignty, territorial integrity and the independence of Ukraine. Croatia stands with Ukraine in these dire times. We have opened our doors to over 11,000 refugees, and we will continue helping by all means, especially in the humanitarian field. Mr. President, the level of destruction and the number of civilian casualties in Ukraine is devastating, as reported by the High Commissioner. There is no justification nor strategic or military significance of targeting civilians, including children. Croatia supports the imminent establishment of an independent international commission of inquiry that will enable the accountability for alleged violation and abuses of human rights and IHL in the country. We urge Russia to respect the international humanitarian law, to protect civilians and to ensure humanitarian corridors and access to life-saving assistance for the people of Ukraine, especially those trapped by constant shelling and attacks. We call upon Russia to end this campaign of war and to settle any dispute by peaceful means in order to stop further bloodshed and the loss of lives. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Polonia. Embajador, tiene la palabra.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam High Commissioner, Poland aligns itself with the EU statement. We are horrified by the ongoing gross violation of international humanitarian and human rights law by Russia, continuing its full-scale military aggression against Ukraine. This invasion has already caused unprecedented humanitarian, refugee and human rights crisis. We urge Russia to fully withdraw its troops from Ukraine and to respect international law. We condemn attacks against civilian population and infrastructure, including schools and hospitals, blocking of humanitarian corridors, abduction of journalists and elected officials, as well as forcible deportation of the population out of Ukraine. Poland is alarmed by the rising numbers of civilian casualties, already counted in thousands, including numerous children, and of millions of displaced persons fleeing the war. Among the latter, there are already more than 2.5 million of persons who found their safe refuge in Poland and are provided by my country with assistance and support delivered on an unprecedented scale. We support territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Poland deplores systemic violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms committed by Russia in occupied Crimea and territories remaining out of control of Ukrainian government. Madam High Commissioner, we are grateful for the work of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, including daily updates on civilian casualties. Protection of everyone's lives and rights is the most important task of the international community. Now the crucial thing is to spare no efforts aimed at restoring respect for international humanitarian and human rights law in the invaded territories, as well as at promptly and fully investigating and documenting all violations. How can the international community effectively support your office in this regard? I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Latvia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Latvia condemns in its strongest possible terms Russia's unprovoked and unjustified military invasion of Ukraine, as well as the participation of Belarus in it. Since the start of the invasion a little over a month ago, OHCHR has recorded more than 3,000 civilian casualties, while noting the actual figures are considerably higher. We are especially concerned about the real number of the casualties in Mariupol, as 90% of the city has been destroyed due to the constant shelling from the Russian forces. Most of the recorded civilian casualties were caused by the use of the explosive weapons, with a wide impact area weapons which should not be used in populated area. Russia must be held accountable for those and other crimes and human rights violations committed in the course of the invasion. We call on Russia to immediately cease its use of force against Ukraine,
stop attacks against all civilians and civilian objects, unconditional withdraw all its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine, and refrain from any further unlawful threat or use of force against any sovereign states. Mr. President, in conclusion, Latvia affirms its unwavering support to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Madam High Commissioner for the comprehensive presentation. Georgia condemns Russia's premeditated, unjustified and unprovoked full-scale military aggression against Ukraine, generating enormous human suffering through indiscriminate attacks on civilian infrastructure, including health facilities, kindergartens and orphanages. As confirmed by the High Commissioner's latest update, gravity of the situation in the country is unspeakable, with already thousands of innocent civilian casualties, among them hundreds of children. In just 1 month, cities and towns have been reduced to rubble, yielding over 10 million forcibly displaced in search of their shelter. Some 13 million people are estimated to be stretched and affected areas or unable to live for safety. It is imperative that these attacks are stopped immediately and that accountability is ensured. We welcome the appointment of experts of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry established according to the UN HRC resolution. We call on Russia to comply with the ICJ provisional measures of 16 March and withdraw all its forces from the whole territory of Ukraine and allow immediate, safe and unfettered access to all international humanitarian and human rights mechanisms. We reiterate our unwavering support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, including Crimea and Donbass, and Ukraine's navigational rights in its territorial waters. Georgia stands by the Ukrainian people in heroic fight to defend their freedom and homeland. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Malta.
Thank you. Malta aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and thanks the High Commissioner for her update. We condemn in the strongest possible terms Russia's unprovoked and unjustified military aggression against Ukraine, which constitutes a gross violation of international law and the UN Charter, and the active involvement of Belarus in this aggression. We join calls on Russia to immediately cease all hostilities, withdraw all its military from Ukraine, and fully respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence. We also call for the immediate cessation of continued targeting of Ukraine's civilian population and civilian infrastructure. Such deliberate attacks are reprehensible and constitute serious violations of international humanitarian law. The humanitarian situation is troubling, and access to humanitarian assistance needs to be ensured for refugees and IDPs. We urge Russia to grant full, safe and unhindered humanitarian access to the entire territory of Ukraine without delay. Malta believes that dialogue must prevail, and we expect that international law and internationally recognized borders are respected and fully recognized in any negotiated outcome. In conclusion, Malta joins others in expressing our full support and solidarity with the government and the people of Ukraine. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Moldova.
Excellency, it's been more than a month since the beginning of the war, 35 days to be precise. Each of them has brought immense loss and suffering to the Ukrainian people. Madam High Commissioner, the update on civilian casualties you have just presented is devastating. We mourn the death of those fallen, especially children. The indiscriminate attacks on schools, hospitals, critical infrastructure are unacceptable. Children should never be a target of military action. The unfolding humanitarian catastrophe is unprecedented, with roughly 10 million people displaced, which represents about a quarter of the population. Over 12 million people remain stranded within affected areas across the country, unable to live due to ongoing hostilities and massive destruction. Moldova is currently hosting around 100,000 people, and among them around 50,000 children. 50,000 children who have lost their homes. Her families have been separated. These numbers are inconceivable, beyond any reason. While being a neutral country, we urge now the Russian Federation to immediately stop all military action in Ukraine and withdraw all its military forces from the country. We plead to uphold international humanitarian law and return to dialogue and diplomacy as the only means for ensuring peace and stability. The Republic of Moldova stands firmly by Ukraine and its brave people. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Bulgaria, embajador.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bulgaria aligns with the statement by the European Union. We thank the High Commissioner for her oral update on Ukraine, which presents a particularly worrying picture of the current human rights and humanitarian situation in the country. Bulgaria strongly condemns Russia's unprovoked, unjustified and unlawful aggression against Ukraine. We support Ukraine in its right to freely and sovereignly determine its future and stand firmly behind the people of Ukraine and its democratically elected institutions. We find it particularly appalling that the large-scale escalation and expansion of Russia's war against Ukraine have resulted in gross human rights violations and breaches of international humanitarian law, including significant loss of civilian lives, large-scale destruction of residential housing and civilian infrastructure, and damage to Ukraine's cultural heritage. We call on Russia to strictly and fully comply with its obligations under international humanitarian law and to ensure safe and unhindered humanitarian access and assistance to those in need, including women, children, the elderly and the disabled. Bulgaria demands full protection of all medical and humanitarian personnel, as well as of hospitals and of other medical facilities. The humanitarian crisis in Ukraine has already led to the displacement of more than 10 million people. Bulgaria has received by now more than 125,000 Ukrainian refugees, including over 20,000 children. We stand ready to provide further support and assistance to the suffering people of Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Eslovenia.
Mr. President, we thank the High Commissioner and the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine for their invaluable work and reporting. We align ourselves with the EU statement. As we speak, the number of civilian casualties in Ukraine continues to grow. Civilians, including children, persons with disabilities, and other persons are trapped in areas of active hostilities. Homes are being destroyed in a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and disregard for the UN Charter. We are appalled by the reports of attacks on schools, orphanages, hospitals, and other civilian infrastructure. Slovenia condemns in the strongest possible terms the unprovoked aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. The hostilities must cease immediately. We urge Russia to cease its military actions, withdraw all its forces, and fully respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence. Full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access, as well as protection and safe passage for civilians, must be ensured. We urge Russia to fully abide by its obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law. We also reiterate our call on Belarus to stop enabling the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Those responsible for the violations must be held accountable for their action. Slovenia is committed to give its share in our joint efforts to protect and assist all refugees from Ukraine fleeing the war, including through international protection, emergency care, education, and health services. We deem it is of utmost importance to particularly protect women and girls from various forms of sexual violence, including trafficking and exploitation. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Macedonia del Norte. Micrófono, por favor, embajadora. Micrófono, por favor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the High Commissioner for a report on the human rights situation in Ukraine, which predates the Russian Federation invasion of Ukraine. The work of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission remains of great importance even in today's war-torn Ukraine. Following Russia's invasion, the situation has tremendously deteriorated during the last month, resulting in increased human rights violations and war crimes. Mr. President, we are devastated about the increasing number of civilian casualties, including children, women, and elderly, while residential areas, hospitals, schools, and cultural sites are being ruthlessly destroyed by Russian military forces. We remain alarmed about the aggravated humanitarian situation in the country, with millions of Ukrainian refugees and IDPs fleeing to find shelter. The Russian unprovoked aggression has left millions of Ukrainians without food, drinking water, power, and essential medicine. We urge immediate, safe, and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance and corridors for safe evacuation of civilians. North Macedonia reiterates its unwavering support to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We call on Russia to immediately end this unjustified and unprovoked war of aggression and to withdraw its military forces from Ukraine in full respect of international law and the UN Charter. There can be no alternative to diplomacy and dialogue. The children of Ukraine, in their myriad expressions of witness, are demanding that adults put an end to this war. And we should listen. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra UN Women.
Thank you, Mr. President. The war in Ukraine is undermining access to rights for all, and UN Women is deeply concerned at the rapidly mounting humanitarian crisis inside Ukraine and its neighboring countries. Over 4 million refugees have already fled the country, the vast majority women and children, and millions more are internally displaced or trapped inside conflict zones, lacking medicine, food, and other necessities. The situation jeopardizes the safety of Ukrainians and puts women and girls in particular at heightened risk of violations, including sexual and gender-based violence. UN Women is working with partners to ensure that the specific needs of women and girls are adequately met. This includes our role as the Secretariat of the United Nations Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, which is rapidly channeling to women's organizations that are uniquely qualified to provide urgent assistance in the region. Together, we are supporting local women's organizations and civil society to sustain their critical operations on the front lines, provide urgent humanitarian aid to women, refugees, and IDPs in Ukraine and Moldova, and to protect women and girls against sexual, gender-based violence, including through critical psychosocial support. We urge the international community to ensure that women and girls are at the center of the humanitarian response, and we echo the UN Secretary General's call for an immediate ceasefire and firm return to diplomacy and dialogue. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Nueva Zelanda. Embajadora, tiene la palabra.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam High Commissioner, thank you for your valuable report. It is now more than 1 month since Russia began its unprovoked and unjustified attack on Ukraine. During this time, the world has witnessed the appalling consequences of Russia's aggression, including thousands of civilian casualties and millions more displaced. Our thoughts are with the people of Ukraine as they continue to suffer due to acts of aggression from Putin's forces. Aotearoa New Zealand is deeply concerned that Russia continues to ignore calls from the international community to cease all military operations in Ukraine and that the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate as a result. It is alarming that a member of the Human Rights Council and Security Council would take action that so seriously undermines human rights and international security. For those nations who are proponents of peace, we must not let Russia's use of pretext, disinformation, and obfuscation interrupt what we know to be true. President Putin has chosen aggression and violence over de-escalation and diplomacy. I finish today by repeating Aotearoa New Zealand's call for President Putin to act consistently with international obligations, immediately cease Russia's military operations in Ukraine, withdraw troops and return to diplomatic negotiations as a pathway to resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Colombia, embajadora. Tiene la palabra.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Colombia manifiesta su mayor solidaridad con Ucrania. El grado de resistencia y valentía del pueblo ucraniano es admirable. Rusia continúa haciendo caso omiso a los llamados de la Asamblea General, la Corte Internacional de Justicia y este Consejo para que detenga sus acciones militares contra Ucrania de manera inmediata. Según el último reporte de ACNUR, 4 millones de personas han abandonado Ucrania para escapar de las acciones militares de Rusia. La invasión y agresión militar, que ha incluido bombardeos contra colegios y hospitales, así como centros poblados, como la ciudad de Mariupol, constituyen graves violaciones al derecho internacional humanitario y los derechos humanos de todos los ucranianos que no pueden quedar en la impunidad. Es por ello que Colombia, con 38 países, solicitó a la Corte Penal Internacional la apertura de una investigación. Con Albania, Dinamarca, Islas Marshall, Países Bajos y Ucrania hemos constituido el Grupo de Amigos para el establecimiento de responsabilidades por la agresión contra Ucrania. Instamos a todos los miembros de Naciones Unidas a apoyar los trabajos y esfuerzos de las diferentes instancias del sistema para que el pueblo ucraniano encuentre justicia y reparación por las graves consecuencias de la agresión militar rusa. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Gracias. Tiene palabra Canadá.
Madam High Commissioner, Canada is horrified by President Putin's unprovoked and unjustifiable invasion of Ukraine and the Russian leadership's cruel disregard for international law, human rights, and for human life. The UN estimates that more than 1,000 civilians have been killed, including 51 children, and more than 10 million individuals have been displaced. Unfortunately, these numbers continue to climb daily as the Russian military targets homes, hospitals, schools, and areas where civilians are sheltering. I want to remind the Russian leadership that these attacks could be found to be war crimes. President Putin is blatantly violating the UN Charter and the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, which are in place to ensure our collective peace and security. He is attacking the rules-based international system that we've all committed to uphold, and in particular, violating international humanitarian law. President Putin is also undermining human rights and fundamental freedoms in Ukraine and beyond. We abhor the Russian leadership's targeting of Ukrainian and Russian journalists and activists who oppose Putin's invasion at great personal risk. We are also deeply concerned by the arbitrary detention and forced disappearance of local Ukrainian officials in regions under the control of Russian forces. We call on the Russian leadership to end its war of choice against Ukraine, unconditionally withdraw its troops and military equipment from Ukraine, and turn to good faith diplomacy. The Ukrainian people must be able to live in peace. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Islandia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Iceland thanks the High Commissioner for her oral report and the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine for its work. Iceland reiterates its support to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Our position remains clear. We do not recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia and strongly condemn Russia's illegal and unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. We're witnessing an escalating pattern of violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law, including Russia's indiscriminate attacks on civilian lives and infrastructure. We urge Russia to uphold its obligations for safe and unhindered humanitarian access in Ukraine. Mr. President, we're deeply alarmed at the security risks faced by journalists and human rights defenders in areas occupied by Russia, as well as the increased repression of media freedom and right to freedom of expression in Russia relating to the war in Ukraine. The right to freedom of opinion and expression must be respected. Prisoners of war must be treated humanely and protected against acts of violence or intimidation, including public curiosity. Iceland stands in full unity with the people of Ukraine and demands the withdrawal of all Russian military personnel and equipment from Ukraine. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra República de Corea. Embajador, tiene la palabra.
Mr. President, I thank the High Commissioner for her updates and welcome the recent report of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. The Republic of Korea strongly condemns Russia's ongoing military aggression against Ukraine, which has caused devastating impacts on the human rights and humanitarian situation on the ground. As the conflict enters its second month, my delegation is troubled by the gravity and magnitude of the Ukrainian people's suffering caused by such military campaign. The use of explosive weapons and indiscriminate shelling in populated areas have led to an alarming record of civilian casualties, as well as destruction of civilian infrastructure, and many civilians are left without access to food, water, and electricity. As a large number of people take refuge or otherwise are trapped by the ongoing fighting, their increasingly precarious situation is indeed worrisome. The protection of civilians must be an urgent priority, and the deliberate attacks on innocent civilians can never be justified under any circumstances. My delegation calls on Russia to immediately end its aggression and to fully respect its obligations under international human rights and humanitarian law. Safe passage to civilians and unhindered humanitarian access must be granted to all affected areas. Lastly, Mr. President, my delegation hopes that the Commission of Inquiry will be operational as early as possible and investigate all alleged human rights violations in close coordination with OHCHR. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Chipre. Embajadora, tiene la palabra.
President, Cyprus aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We closely follow the unfolding events in Ukraine and were deeply troubled by the deteriorating security situation and the ever-escalating and flagrant international humanitarian law and human rights violations. Cyprus reiterates its support to the territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence of Ukraine and urgently calls on the Russian Federation to cease its military operations and withdraw its troops. We are gravely alarmed by reports of indiscriminate shelling in civilian populated areas. The protection of the civilian population must be of utmost priority. Civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, must in no circumstances be the object of attack and must at all times be respected and protected. We also underscore that cultural property must also be protected and safeguarded. Unhindered humanitarian access must be ensured, allowing for the safe passage of evacuees and for humanitarian aid to be delivered. We're also deeply concerned over the increasing number of refugees and internally displaced persons, as well as reports of potential forced displacement. The humanitarian consequences of armed conflicts are mostly borne by women, children, and persons in vulnerable situations. Russia must be held accountable. Cyprus stands in solidarity with the courageous people of Ukraine. I thank you.
Thank you. Tenha a palavra a delegação do Portugal, embaixador, tenha a palavra.
Gracias, Senhor Presidente e Senhora Alta Comissionada. Portugal aligns itself with the European Union statement. We thank the High Commissioner for her update and for the work of the monitoring mission in Ukraine, which has continued despite the war. Today's update portrays a somber scenario of devastation and violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. Portugal reiterates its condemnation of the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine in violation of international law and the UN Charter. Military hostilities must immediately cease. We remain in solidarity with Ukraine and reiterate our unwavering support to its sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence. The humanitarian and human rights impact of this war will last for generations. All civilians are victims of this unjustified war. Human rights of children, persons with disabilities, older persons and all already vulnerable are being violated in multiple ways. The consequences for physical and mental health will be tremendous and long-lasting. The indiscriminate attacks on civil infrastructure must stop. This war is provoking the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. Millions of persons had to flee and are seeking refuge abroad. Even more are internally displaced in Ukraine. Portugal remains ready to welcome refugees from Ukraine. Around 25,000 are already with us, including a significant number of unaccompanied children. Under our temporary protection system, refugees are given automatic access to health care and social security. We have also created housing and employment pools. Thank you very much.
Obrigado. Tiene la palabra Italia. Ambasciatore, tiene la palabra.
Signora Alta Commissionata, Signor Presidente, Italy announced itself with a statement delivered by the EU and expressed its deep concern for the grave deterioration of the human rights situation in Ukraine and the humanitarian catastrophe caused by the unjustified and unprovoked military aggression by the Russian Federation. As documented also by the OHCHR, the war is resulting in tragic loss of life and unbearable human suffering, with the number of civilian casualties, including children, increasing every day, and the mass displacement of millions of persons already forced to flee their homes. We are particularly concerned by the large-scale destruction and damage of civilian infrastructures, including medical and education facilities, the number of journalists and media workers killed and injured since the start of the conflict, and the reports of alleged sexual and gender-based violence against women and girls. Italy strongly supports all measures to ensure full accountability for human rights violations, as well as violation of international humanitarian law occurring in Ukraine, and welcomes in this regard the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry by the Human Rights Council, the invocation of the OSCE Moscow mechanism, as well as the investigation launched by the ICC. Italy renews its call on Russia to fully abide by its obligation on international law, immediately cease all military actions, and ensure safe corridors for the evacuation of civilians from conflict-affected areas, as well as full, safe, and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance. In conclusion, I wish to reaffirm once again Italy's full solidarity with Ukraine and its people. I thank you.
Gracias. Y último orador en la lista de los estados, Grecia. Embajador, tiene la palabra.
Gracias, Presidente. Mr. President, Madam High Commissioner, Greece allies with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for her update. The war in Ukraine rages on and the toll of civilian casualties keeps rising. Russian forces are directing attacks against the civilian population, targeting civilian infrastructure such as hospitals, medical facilities, schools, and shelters. They are resorting to siege tactics and forced deportation while failing to provide humanitarian corridors. Even nuclear plants are threatened. More than 10 million people have been forced to flee their homes. Those staying behind live in shelters lacking food, water, and basic goods and services to survive the harsh winter. In Mariupol, a centuries-old Greek community, 150,000 strong, suffers under Russian siege. Its members are forced to abandon lands they have called home from time immemorial. Mr. President, Greece stands by Ukraine and its people. We condemn in the strongest possible terms the military aggression by the Russian Federation. It constitutes a gross violation of international law, including UN Charter, IHL, and international human rights law. We call upon Russia to abide by its obligations. Madam High Commissioner, in your view, what more can be done to ensure an effective accountability? I thank you.
Thank you. Y ahora vamos a pasar a la lista de organizaciones nacionales y ONGs. En primer lugar, informo, hay una organización nacional, institución nacional anotada, que hubo un error técnico. El video presentado es de una extensión mucho mayor que el aceptado, así que pido disculpas. Vamos a interrumpir el video en el momento del tiempo acordado conforme a lo que todos hemos aceptado, pero la intervención completa va a estar en la extranet, pero el video en sí lo vamos a parar en el minuto 30 como el resto de todas las intervenciones. Así que pido disculpas anticipadamente por este tema. Entonces le doy la palabra, en primer lugar, a comisionado de Derechos Humanos del Parlamento ucraniano. Tiene la palabra.
Уважаемый господин председатель, дамы и господа, в Украине второй месяц идет разрушительная война, вероломно развязанная Российской Федерацией по всей территории нашей страны. Эта война стала продолжением вторжения, начатого в 2014 году, когда были временно оккупированы Крым, Севастополь, а также отдельные территории Донецкой и Луганской областей. В эти минуты войска врага ведут обстрелы населенных пунктов почти во всех областях нашего государства, цинично нарушая требования Женевской конвенции 1949 года. Агрессор ведет целенаправленные обстрелы авиацией, ракетами, системами залпового огня гражданских объектов, жилых кварталов, детских садов, школ и больниц. Ежечасно растет количество жертв среди мирного населения и детей. Уже убито 135 детей и искалечено 173. Разрушено более 4500 жилых домов, 135 больниц, 566 учебных заведений. Российские оккупанты похищают мирных жителей, мэров городов и других представителей органов местной власти, общественных активистов, убивают и калечат представителей прессы. Война вынудила более 3 600 000 граждан Украины стать беженцами, 1 800 000 из которых – это дети. 12 миллионов стали внутренне перемещенными лицами, и их число растет каждый день. Мы осуществляем сбор фактов нарушений прав человека.
Continuamos con la lista. Tiene la palabra Baptist World Alliance.
Madam President, we express today our support of peace and justice by strongly condemning the aggression against Ukraine. We categorically denounce the possibility of using nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons in this conflict. With the support of the global Baptist family, Baptist churches across Ukraine tirelessly provide aid for internally displaced people. Our related churches in bordering countries have aided hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing the conflict. Baptist churches in the cities of Mariupol, Luhansk, Kherson, and other cities across Ukraine are providing food and shelter to thousands. We call for protection of humanitarian corridors to deliver aid and to allow for civilians to flee combat zones. Baptist World Alliance continues to monitor the treatment of minority religious groups in occupied areas of Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk. We have given statements before this Council about human rights violations that have occurred in the occupied regions. We express concern that repression of human rights could now spread beyond these regions. Finally, we encourage a settlement of the conflict, which includes consideration the protection of religious, cultural, and linguistic minorities to guarantee a free and peaceful future for all Ukraine's citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Joint Statement, Swedish Federation of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Rights.
This statement is delivered to you by RFSL and CSC Netherlands on behalf of a group of grassroots LGBT organizations from Ukraine. The ongoing Russian invasion in Ukraine continues to bring devastation and suffering to millions and push vulnerable groups further into marginalization. Pre-existing prejudices threaten the safety and security of LGBTI people in contexts that expose them to others at different stages of their displacement. At the same time, evidence shows that LGBTI people are systematically excluded from humanitarian assistance, and organizations that have never specialized in direct assistance are adapting to provide aid to LGBTI communities. Even so, resources are scarce and finite. Among other things, there are already shortages of medication vitally important for trans and intersex people, as well as community members living with HIV. Trans people are particularly vulnerable as they are faced with human rights violations while often being denied exit from the country due to inconsistent regulations on the exemption from military service and pre-existing lack of access to swift, transparent, and accessible legal gender recognition procedures. Alongside the immediate challenges, this war will have severe long-term effects beyond the displacement of people and the destruction of buildings and infrastructure, requiring not only immediate support but also long-term support to safeguard the advancement of human rights of LGBTI people in Ukraine that have been achieved over the last few years. Thank you.
Thank you.